And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's great to be here with you. And of course, it's been a very exciting week. I have to say that it's so interesting. There's a little bit of a deja vu because last week we started off with the Snopes story. And of course, we're joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And so it was strange, and this is just going to be a little aside before we get into everything that we're doing tonight, dealing with the UK aspect, Queen Elizabeth, Pine Gap, which is very significant, and there's some stealth archives rising to the surface there. But we're going to be able to track this whole story through the Queen and her advisor, Peter Horsley, very interesting fellow. And we're going to do it in a way that takes us all the way back to Samaria, believe it or not. I was very shocked by this as well. And right in the middle of it all was the X Stenography carrying us through whenever we got around the unusual questions of advanced technology. It's been pretty remarkable as more and more is coming to the surface. Now, before we get to everything, Snopes last week came on the record and said, well, the Nixon time capsule story, that's something that really, is unproven. They didn't say it was false. And but in the article, they said, well, it's preposterous and absurd and all these things. So they really took some shots at it, and for apparently no reason. But for me, that was kind of the opening salvo on the mainstream side against the story of Nixon's time capsule, which was told to me by Robert Merritt on this program back in February. And he went forward talking about how he had been an agent for Nixon. And there's quite a trail from Merritt as we go back in history. And we did kind of a capsule version of that. It's about a 5-minute video that we put out this week just to get everybody reminded of all the major details involved there. But anyway, Snopes went on the record there. And of course, I went into Snopes history last week that they're helping Facebook with this anti-fake news initiative, really something less than spectacular there, and claiming that they're going to save humanity and civilization doing it. We also found out that they're heavily funded by the Amazing Randy's Foundation. And of course, Randy's husband is serving time for identity theft. So very strange connections, I would say, going on there around Snopes. But anyway, this week, in an odd twist to this whole thing, Snopes comes out and says they don't touch the time capsule story this time, but they do go to the Nixon-Trump letter, which we've shown on this program from 1987, where Trump convinces Nixon to someday run for president because he knows by prediction he'll win. And what's so interesting about this is they go to bat for it, and they say, yeah, this is real. Of course, it's on the record, and they're going to look ridiculous. But it seems like Snopes is doubling down on this story because they're sort of covering themselves on both ends to say that we're blocking it over here, but they're also coming out of the blue and supporting the Trump story. Now, there was nothing to do but support that story because it's on the record, one. The letter is at the National Archives. You're not going to meet that. You're not going to beat that. And also, interestingly enough, when you put these details together, their relationship, Nixon and Trump, was much deeper than we've been led to believe. As a matter of fact, Trump flew Nixon around on his private jet. Nixon moved to New York and became friends with Trump, and in all likelihood gave him very serious advice about how to position himself to run for president. As a matter of fact, in that year that they're spotted together at these various functions, and they're doing a fundraiser for former Texas Governor John Connally, who happened to be in the car when Kennedy was assassinated. Just very strange optics, strange visuals. But it turns out that Trump gives a speech in New Hampshire, and I have more details on that. I have the video clip, but I was trying to, I didn't get into screen snapping that, but I am going to show some of that. And I do think it's significant that there he was sounding like a presidential candidate, and we know he had recently come into this relationship with Nixon. So it's very fascinating. So a little deja vu there on the Snopes side this week. Last week, bashing the time capsule. This week, confirming the letter. And I think that that's particularly significant. Now, as I've been going into this, And by the way, you can feel free to ask your questions for later now also. And Olivia always reminds me to remind everyone to do them all in caps. That way it helps her because there's so many and it's going so fast. Did you have something, Olivia?
No.
Okay. I saw you waving over there. But as long as it's not a two-hand wave, you know you're okay. If it's a two-hand wave, then we've got something to work with. So going into the UK aspect, what I want to do is give just that foundation again for people who don't know what the X series that I'm doing here is all about. And for those of you who do know, there's a few things in here that will pop out. What I've determined from pretty deep research is that there's a steganography that's being used, a symbolism, a messaging that's being used when they move this advanced technology around. And it goes back a long time, but I'm going to snapshot it here really since the 40s. And that's through the figure of Walter Dornberger, who was a Nazi that was in charge of the Nazi rocket program. A very advanced guy on the technical side, but quite a zealot. As a matter of fact, one of the interesting things about Dornberger that I discovered was when the Allies had him in custody, they actually, the first reports were that this isn't looking good. This guy is never going to convert to the American side. As a matter of fact, he's trying to turn the other guys in captivity against us, you know? So he's kind of the Nazi to the last. And Dornberger is very fascinating. Eventually, we let him go, and he comes here to America, and we enlist him in the space program. And then he becomes the president of Bell Helicopter and Bell Aerospace. Quite a position, quite a position. And one of his main recruits will be Michael Payne. And Michael Payne and his wife, Ruth, who's a Quaker, will become the hosts to Lee and Marina Oswald when they come back from the Soviet Union. That string of events is very significant, as is the fact that Dornberger showed up as a dinner guest at the Nixon White House on more than one occasion. And I've shown those, you know, the log from the White House on that, but just showing that Dornberger was so close and so important in the whole space program aspect. And as a matter of fact, Werner von Braun was his understudy and basically his, like, you know, 20-year-old intern when he was doing this. So he had started very early. And there's a point where, and I went through this with Joseph Farrell, who knows the story a lot better than I do, where actually, you know, these different characters are coming in, and Himmler comes in, and he finds out that von Braun has said, you know, I'm not interested actually in the war aspects. I kind of want to get this thing to space about the rocket program. So they're literally going to execute him. And Dornberger says, if you execute him, you set back the space program by years and years. And what happens with Dornberger is when they launched the first V2 rockets, he said, he has this famous quote when he turns to von Braun and says, now we have entered the space age. And he was absolutely fascinated by space. And his entire program, when he got to America and the incredible output that he had for our various aerospace industries, was that he contributed the X, and the X series for these different planes, which were space planes, which some in the 1960s that they ran and they flew still hold records for speed, even though it's 50 years later, because they were just designed to do this. And this is going to come around in such a major way in this conversation. And I'm very excited about it because there's a few things tonight that are going to blow everybody away. And, you know, it's one of those things where the connections are coming in so strong, and we're on such a role of understanding where these things fit, that the more pieces you get, the more things come in to fill the picture out. And that's about where we are right now. So when we get through Dornberger, we roll into Blue Gemini. And Blue Gemini is a very mysterious program that they try to do outside of the auspices of the presidency at first. This is something that they started up under Eisenhower, and there was a trade-off there. I'd been trying to figure out where was the X trade-off between what they were doing and when they got to Blue Gemini. But let's stick with Blue Gemini just for a minute. Blue Gemini was this program for basically UFO recon, and they had this kind of a half black project and half public project, and there's all this hubbub about it. And finally, JFK realizes, you know what? certain NASA aspects are getting infiltrated here. What I need to do is throw this project back to the military, which is a very odd move for him because, he had tried to keep the space program as a very non-military thing, which Eisenhower had designed it as. So we're getting into this whole NASA aspect with Blue Gemini, but there's a force there behind Blue Gemini that's pushing it. Incredible budgets, both off and on the record for Blue Gemini. And the program gets killed because at a certain point, the cover is blown on it. And Robert McNamara, who is the defense secretary for JFK, comes in and says, "What are you guys doing? I feel like we're looking here at two totally different national space programs." That's the first indication in a document, and we've only had the document since 2015. That's the first indication of the secret space program that we talk so much about here, and which gets bandied about in so many different ways. But the real solid research, you would look to people like Gary McKinnon and Joseph Farrell to really understand what that's all about. But that secret space program, they're the roots of it in that conversation. And so they bounce it back to the military in this odd move. And those people at NASA who are working with the Dornberger types and the von Braun push in there are really confused by this whole move. Now, you might say, well, Blue Gemini, this is something that took place in 1960 and was finally decommissioned in 62. What's the big deal? That technology and what they were going for is so closely mirrored with the X Stenography that we're looking at them moving that exotic technology. And Blue Gemini is a very important point. It's a high point. It's the battle between the covert program and the overt program. It's a public state fighting with the deep state there. Of course, that's Blue Gemini. That's their original seal. Very interesting as we have the 7 stars up there, a little reference to the Pleiades. There's a few interesting things relating to their uniforms and stuff, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that. And I do feel that we pretty much hit the high note on McNamara's main points. He says a lot more, but that's pretty much all you need to know. Now, fascinatingly enough, when we look for the trail of Blue Gemini, I have found where the program moved to in this in-between space. But just for those who feel that, Blue Gemini is just some space program back there, I want you to observe this. This is from 2014, talking about the new program coming out for Windows software and Windows Office Gemini to replace or complement Windows Blue Twin. And there's a whole thing in here about how they were, building up this incredible thing and no one knew what it was. They thought it was a new version of Blue. But they said, is there a new Blue version of Office? Is there one, a next generation Microsoft release? And then it goes, there is, but it's not codenamed Blue. It's codenamed Gemini. Now, these references, people, when they work on these levels, and of course, Bill Gates was the person who started this company, and a lot of that crew around him since he left, they know about these things. They understand it and they use it, just like Apple is very fond of using the X. They understand on a higher level those legends, and they may actually be clued in and passed along those secrets of where the technology comes from. We've gone into this show before about our friend here, Elon Musk, owning X.com. His latest release, of course, is an X craft. We have the SpaceX Falcon. And of course, Falcon is the name of the titular head of the Aviary, which was this group of CIA people who were trying to come up with ways to come out with this kind of half-baked disclosure thing in the 80s and 90s, through the CIA prism, of course, not real disclosure. Very much like the TTSA and all the Tom DeLonge thing. One day Tom DeLonge is sitting there with a book talking about, I'm going to do the Secret Machines book. The next day they do this big push and there's like 9 guys who are CIA officers, and they push the CIA officers out to the press, and it's like, oh, I see, you've been CIA'd and Bigelowized because Bob Bigelow and Bigelow Aerospace. So this is another quick one I wanted to show everybody before we get out of that, just because I don't like coincidences that hang out. This is a game that was developed in Silicon Valley, and it was called UFO Detection. I'll just show you a little corner there, XCOM You can do some research on that. But check out a few of the functions here that this game is engaged in. Alien craft regularly enter and leave the Earth's atmosphere in UFOs, or traverse in and out of deeper reaches of the ocean. In order to prevent them from carrying out their missions, you, UFO detection, XCOM, shoot them down or assault them while grounded. However, in order to perform either of these tasks, you must first spot them, which requires some type of UFO detection equipment, either in your bases, using your craft, and subradar. Okay, so again, this idea, just like the project, Windows Blue, Windows Gemini, these people are aware of these things, and they integrate the ideas into games, into software, and all the rest of it. And we wonder, where does this stuff come from? So it seems like some Hollywood producer is picking up on it. But the X Stenography rides itself through history. Now, there's a very crucial point that involves the royal family. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce it, and then we're going to backtrack into the royal family, because, far and away from leaving the royal family out of the UFO Stenography, there she is. That's Queen Elizabeth, looking very, very regal and decked out. But we start to understand just what an important person she is in the quest for X. And there she is, a little bit younger, which is the period we're going to talk about tonight before she becomes the full queen. And we're going to talk about her advisor, Sir Peter Horsley, and his very interesting experience with Mr. Janus, who he concluded later was an extraterrestrial who came to visit him. And her advisor was, part of Strike Force. He had his finger on the nuclear button and had a major position in their military, and he was the advisor to both the Duke of Edinburgh and to the Queen. So, this is an incredibly high-level admission in a book that came out in 1998. And I've been reading the book. It's absolutely fascinating. It's very hard to get, but you can still get a, you can get a Kindle version of it, which is good enough, but the actual book is a little hard to get. Of course, not everyone has the eagle-eyed Olivia on their side. So, so we're able to kind of get these types of things. But let's take a look. There he is, and quite an amazing guy. I've seen interviews with him. I wish I had had a chance to meet him. He's no longer with us. I'd have some great questions for him, and I feel like he was being very honest. And when you go down to that real hardcore British command, and you look at their quotes about his comments about UFOs and aliens, they said whatever he said. He wasn't the kind of guy who minced words. He didn't mess around. And so we're going to really dive into what Sir Peter Horsley was telling us. The name of the book is Sounds from Another Room, Memories of Planes, Princes, and the Paranormal. It's quite unusual. Now, there is a very interesting aside in the book where he gets shot down when he is flying during World War II. And his buddy is in the back. And, he keeps saying to his buddy, get ready to jump when I jump. And, let's do this. And when he jumped out, he didn't see his friend. And when he hit the water, his friend wasn't there. And he survived for 3 days. And he had this really harrowing experience at sea before he was picked up. He was 3 days just thinking he was dying and he was leaving his body. And I think this is what gave him the extra insight, actually. But it puzzled him when he got into the hospital and he was lying there in bed and he said to himself, where is my friend? Like, what happened to him? Why didn't he jump at the parachute? And this, he was feverish and all the rest of it. So in this state, his friend comes to him, and the friend died, in fact. And the friend says, I didn't bring my parachute. So, this kind of elevated the mystery for him. But it was absolutely fascinating that he had this kind of vision. He had this kind of extra sight after that experience. And he has a few more unusual experiences along the way. I don't think he goes into everything in the book, but the chapter concerning Mr. Janus is absolutely fascinating. Now, let's jump to Mr. Janus for a moment. When we look at history in terms of unusual occasions regarding visitors from UFOs, regarding stories about extraterrestrials or people who've come here, there's so many from Val Thor. We have all this incredible kind of themes from the 40s and 50s of these space visitors coming to visit and saying things and getting, they're very human. And later on, you'd have stories about Pleiadians doing the same things. This is far before we got into grays and things of this nature. But Mr. Janus is very unusual because the whole entire setup for it is quite bizarre. It turns out that Prince Philip, who's the Queen's husband, was very curious, very interested in the UFO subject. And even the way that Horsley talks about it, you can tell he's projecting things because he's still, in the service of the royal house. And Horsley says, at a certain point, he set me out and said, can you get to the bottom of this mystery? Which was interesting enough because he was already very interested in it. And somehow they had this kind of camaraderie around it. Now, interestingly enough, one of the major things that Horsley was known for in his flying was flying the Meteor X. And his steganography of being associated with Meteor X, I think, is quite significant, as we'll learn. So let's learn a little bit about Sir Beresford Peter Torrington Horsley. And I do recommend everyone get as much information on him as you can. He began his military career in 39, boarded the TSS Cyclops, and so on and so on. In July of 49, Horsley entered the royal household as a squadron leader, as an equerry. So this is advisor, as I understand it, to Her Royal Highness the Princess Elizabeth, Duchess of Edinburgh, better known today as Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and to His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. In 1952, Horsley became a wing commander. Now you can see he rose very fast. I mean, he's right in the royal house, and that's 10 years basically after he joins the military service. So this guy rose in the ranks and just was an incredible squadron leader. So he became a wing commander, and in 53 became full-time equerry to the Duke of Edinburgh. So he is the advisor to the Duke of Edinburgh and to the Queen, and also before she's the Queen, and she's just the princess. It was a role he held until 1956. His final post in the Royal Air Force was as the Deputy Commander-in-Chief of Strike Command. That is the nuclear command. So incredibly high-level position after advising the royal couple. So his final post in the Royal Air Force was as Deputy Commander-in-Chief of Strike Command, which he held from 1973 until 1975. And there's one more thing. Horsley's other claim to fame is that in late 1954, he had a face-to-face encounter with a human-looking alien who went by the memorable and mysterious name of Mr. Janus. Now, Mr. Janus, this whole thing comes up, and I will spare us all the details about it and get right to the point. What happens is, while he's on this quest for Prince Philip, and he's saying, find out everything you can about it. And someone just mentioned Timothy Good up there. Absolutely. That's a fantastic book, and Timothy Good gave great interviews about it. And I had the good fortune to speak with Timothy Good. And I understand he's not really doing interviews right now. He has some kind of a health condition, but wow, the guy has contributed vastly to our understanding on this. So I would, if you read the Timothy Good book about it and then go right to the biography, because there's a whole chapter on Mr. Janus in here, and their conversation is fascinating, but I'm not going to jump ahead. All right. So as it turns out, this General Martin gets in touch with Sir Peter Horsley, and he says, you really have got to talk to this woman, and her name is Mrs. Markham, and she's at such and such address. And it turns out, by the way, as I have tracked down the story, that Markham is the name of one of the streets that they sent him to. It's at the corner of the street that they sent him to. So I think Markham was just this kind of put on name. So anyway, he goes in there, and he follows him up on this. And, basically General Martin says, I'm interested in the subject myself, extraterrestrials. I heard you were looking into this. How about this? He You meet this woman, you'll find her fascinating. She will tell you so much what you want to know about the subject relating to UFOs. And I understand that you're looking for it, for Philip, and you'll have all this incredible detail to go back to him with. So Horsley's satisfied. He's excited to do this, and he gives an incredible detail of it in his autobiography. But here's the short version. He shows up, and it's a very dimly lit room right away. The vibe is a little unusual. And in the room, Mrs. Markham lets him in and says, this is Mr. Janus. He wants to speak to you. And Mr. Janus is a very well-dressed man, about 40, very penetrating gaze. And he is very relaxed and speaks just like a normal Englishman, or kind of a upper crust guy. So they start to talk, and it turns out in their conversation that Horsley gets quite unnerved right off the bat, because Mr. Janus says, your nuclear base and so may not be as well protected as you think it is. And he says, you also have these other nuclear bases up here, which could have accidents. And he's basically laying out a military map for him. So right off the bat, Horsley is really freaked out by what the stranger knows, the intimate details that he knows about the British nuclear program, their military installations, their bases, and all the rest of it. And he says, what do you think is going on with the UFO thing? Horsley asked Janus, and Janus says, well, we've been visiting here for a long time, but what's happening is you're basically looking at a situation where the nuclear aspects of your technology might threaten not only this planet, but other planets as well. And he gives them this kind of incredible overview of the situation and the galaxy and all the rest of it, and the extraterrestrial factor in relation to politics, and how mankind basically has to curb themselves from this whole nuclear atomic age, or else they're really going to get consumed. And not only that, they'll cause disruptions for other life forms in other parts of the galaxy and all the rest of it. So I'm going to give you just a couple of quick quotes from Horsley. What he actually said here is, Janus was there. That's Janus, which is going to be very significant in about 5 minutes. Was sitting there by the fire in a deep chair. He asked, what is your interest in flying saucers? We talked for hours about traveling in space and time. I don't know who or what he was. He didn't say he was a visitor from another planet, but I had that impression. I believe he was there to observe us. I never saw him again. I have no qualms about the reaction of my experience with Mr. Janus. So Janus goes on to tell him the things that I was just mentioning, that the ever-growing nuclear arsenals are dangerous. And Timothy Good, there's a quote here from Good, which says, in my second and last meeting with Sir Peter Horsley, which I believe the year he died, at his home in 2000, he revealed that in addition to being disturbed by the realization that Janus was reading his mind, he understood that as he was speaking to him. Janus is kind of whipping things off, showing his telepathic ability. Horsley was even more disturbed by the fact that this extraordinary man knew all of Britain's top secret nuclear installations. Okay, so we have a mysterious visitor who trips in to Peter Horsley's investigations on behalf of the royal family, looking into the UFO aspect. General Martin, who says, this is really something you can learn about. This is something you can get into. And this woman is really going to help you with that. So he goes back and he talks to Prince Philip after all this. And he says, I had this incredible encounter. And this is what he said. And I think that this guy has a lot of keys to it. And Philip was like, there's something very dangerous going on here. If you know all the military installations, you got to go back and talk to that guy. And, you probably want to figure out what was going on there. Now, one of the key things that I forgot to mention is that when Peter Horsley was speaking with Mr. Janus, he says to him, what do you want from me, basically? Why are you here telling me these things? And interestingly enough, Janus says, I want a meeting with Prince Philip. And interestingly enough, what's fascinating about this is Horsley's a little bit perplexed by it. He says, it's going to be very hard to arrange. Like, you've got me. Why don't you tell me what's on your mind? And he said, well, the Duke of Edinburgh, he's a man who really understands his place and the place of peace in the world. And he's going to be somebody who could really bring this program forward of stopping the exponential nuclear parts and then what could happen and all the rest of it. So he gives them that as really the reason why they're having this incredible 3-hour conversation, which I do find the entire conversation is very interesting. And I've given kind of a condensed version there, but I think you get the idea. So interestingly enough, we go into this period where he says, okay, in speaking with Prince Philip, I will. That's exactly what I'm going to go back, and I'll talk to Mrs. Markham, and I'll get in touch with Mr. Janus again, and we'll bring him around to security and make sure he's legit. Which, oddly enough, he didn't do in the first place, because he thought, quote, General Martin had handled that, had already cleared this guy. Well, suddenly General Martin becomes very hard to get in touch with, which is interesting off the bat. Later, he goes and he's like, I'm going to go with a few security people over there. He goes back to the building and it's all been cleaned out. Everything's gone. As a matter of fact, the place itself hadn't been rented in something like over 3 months. So there was nobody there. They were using this apartment that hadn't been rented, and it was just happened to be vacant. There's no Mrs. Markham. There's no Mr. Janus. And General Martin disappears from the picture pretty fast, too. So this is the nature of the unusual contact that happened. And Horsley was left with his whole life with this question. Now, as I said, Horsley had almost paranormal abilities from his unusual, from being shot down during World War II and hitting the water and his friend dying, coming to him later. This kind of altered his consciousness in some way. So it seemed like this mission was set up for him. But it looks like Mr. Janus was a little disappointed that he wasn't going to get this meeting with the Duke of Edinburgh. And he probably felt, I'm still talking to a military man. I need to go deeper, right to the leadership. So Janus does not achieve his mission. But I want to talk about what Janus was representing in this whole thing. Because, some people have said, well, this is some kind of a game that these, very deep players were playing with both Philip and Peter Horsley. And it was some kind of a, breakaway deep state op in order to check out their mindset about these things. My own conclusions is that based on the nature of the contact, that it doesn't have anything to do with traditional intelligence methods. It seems to me a totally different type of intelligence trying to contact the royal house, in this case, through Horsley. And so I think it's very well arranged. Whatever you want to say that intelligence is, it's not the traditional kind of CIA, MI6 type of intelligence that we're dealing with there. Very significant, however. And that Horsley is famous for flying the Meteor X gives us enough to follow there to understand that the X is in play in dealing with this. Let's talk about Janus for a minute, because the visitor is using steganography himself there with the name. And so Janus is at first here in our understanding a Roman god, and he's a two-faced god, generally meaning dual nature. Now, interestingly enough about Janus, he's associated with time, with beginnings, with space, the sun, the moon, and the stars. That's his basic kind of fundamental thing. And, they said it was associated with January, and that actually was a different one that was associated with that. As it turns out, as they've done deeper and deeper research on the god Janus, they've figured out, actually, that this figure goes back to Sumeria. And let me see if I have, hang on just a second here. There it is. There's a couple of players to point out here. This is going to be interesting, and I'll show other pictures of this. But this over here is Janus. It's the two-face figure. As you can see, there's one face and another face. And he is behind Enki, who is, we know very well in our Sumerian mythology, plays quite a role in the development of mankind and preserving it and all the rest. So the name of this god, who was Janus later for the Romans, is called Izimud. And I'm just going to read you this quick sketch of Izimud. Izimud, he's the associated with the messenger of the gods. And in this case, the messenger that he's associated for is the god Enki. So he's a god, he's Enki's messenger. In Sumerian mythology, in ancient Sumerian artwork, Izimud is easily identifiable because he is always depicted with two faces facing in opposite directions in a very similar manner to the ancient Roman god Janus. So he shows up with this. And again, this dual nature thing. You could say his nature could be half divine and half earthly, or his nature is, part ET and part human. It's a hard thing to figure out. He's part spiritual, part physical. But he has this dual nature, and that's what they are reinforcing. This is what they pick up on. It's a very unusual, as we could see in the Janus picture, it's an unusual symbolism for them to be using. And when we think about Janus and going back to this. Now let's just get a quick look at Izimud. Izimud appears in the legend of Inanna and Enki, in which he is the one who greets Inanna upon her arrival at the Apsu temple. He is also the one who informs Enki that the Mies have been stolen. This is very interesting. Izimud serves as a messenger telling Inanna to return the Mies to Enki or face the consequences. Okay, so she's stolen something incredibly valuable, but what are the Mies? Now, this is kind of fascinating because there's so many different places we could go with the Enki stuff. I'm going to keep it down to Izimud. But keep in mind, when I mention Izimud, I'm talking about Janus, because it's the two-faced version of the god in Sumerian times. He graduated to Janus by the time he hits the Romans. But I think it's very important to find out what he has to report on that's been stolen. And when he's talking to Enki, because of course, in the alternative research community, we've been Sumerianed to death and Sitchined to death. But that doesn't mean that there isn't so much important information there. It's just that people ran away with the marketing aspects of the Anunnaki, for example, just like they run away with the marketing aspects of the secret space program. Nonetheless, the solid information in the heart of this material is kind of leading us forward. So let's find out what had been stolen and what he was being a messenger of. And we'll pay very close attention to this because we're tracking back now from the royal household meeting, sending off Sir Peter Horsley to find out about UFOs, to him meeting this mysterious Mr. Janus under mysterious circumstances, and Janus disappearing after telling him that ETs are keeping an eye on Earth because of the nuclear problem and a whole lot of other things that are the more we dig into it, the more things we find. Now, in Sumerian mythology, a me is one of the decrees of the gods that is foundational to the social institutions, religious practices, technologies, behaviors, and more. So they're handing something down. Now, it's very often, the way that's depicted is very odd, because a mies will be like a box, or it'll be a figure. Whatever it happens to be, it's never described. It's kind of like the object of desire, in a sense. But the entire... there's a poem called Enki and the World Order in which these appear. And I'm going to read just a list of some of these because they are quite interesting. And there's more than 100 mies, and they appear to be mentioned in the latter myth. So I'll just go through a couple. Godship, the exalted and enduring crown, the throne of kingship, the exalted scepter, the royal insignia, the exalted shrine, shepherdship, kingship, lasting ladyship, divine lady, that's a priestly office there, truth, descent into the netherworld, and weapons and sexual intercourse. These are, there's more, of course, but the ones relating to royal scepters and the royal house and all the rest of it, the throne of kingship, the royal insignia, I think we start to understand what they're getting at with Janus. They're giving us something in this interaction. In that interaction, the name always bothered me. Not that the name isn't used. And again, just like X, X, although it's used the least to start a word of any other letter in the alphabet, certainly you can find it in a variety of public places and in traditional documents. It's not that the X would be that mysterious. What we're looking for is its use and the circumstances under which it pops up, just like the X Stenography that we've seen in these different programs. Whenever we get around one of these important people dealing with it, we run smack into that X Stenography from Dornberger to Pine Gap and beyond. We're going to get into Pine Gap and Queen Elizabeth and her relationship to it because it's actually the crux of the whole episode. But let's just do a quick check-in there with Olivia. How are we doing and how is everyone tonight?
Fantastic.
Okay, good. We have a great crowd tonight. It's actually a very full house, and it's great to have so many of you with us. I want to remind everyone to sign up for our newsletter at darkjournalist.com. It's the best way to stay up to date on the shows, because very often, so I get emails all the time from people who tell me, we didn't get the notice relating to the show. I missed the live version. I really want to be there for the live one. We do live shows every Friday at 7 o'clock. We haven't missed one just a couple of times this year, basically. And sometimes on holidays and on special occasions when we have special reports, we'll do other live ones. But you can look for us generally at Fridays at 7 p.m. Eastern time. But you want to sign up for the newsletter because of the type of season that we're in terms of research and the things that we're doing this spring and the incredible shows that we have coming up for you in April. I don't want you to miss any of that. So make sure that you go there and just sign up for the newsletter. It's free, and it keeps you and I updated with each other. We all know with the developments around social media and the clampdown that's going on and the strange things like the YouTube, they had this YouTube shooter and, none of that stuff sits very well with me, frankly. And just as a little aside here, I was fascinated by the fact that when the story came up about this YouTube shooter, that the mainstream media had their reasons for laying off that story, but so did the alternative media. And I felt that the alternative media didn't have their standard were being set up. It's a false flag answer for it, because in some ways, this idea of a fanatic doing this isn't the kind of story that they want to run down. So they leave all these incredible details on the ground because it doesn't fit their narrative. So in some aspects of the alternative media are acting just like the regular media, that sometimes when you look at it, you say, what's the difference? Just two different sides of an agenda. And so what we really need, and what I try to bring forward with dark journalism, is we have to come right down the middle between those intel psyops on one hand, pressuring the information and the narrative, and the kind of marketing moves, and the general political vying for power that's going on right now is just, so off the charts that it is, it's something very explosive. But that is another show. But I did want to mention that because there is something about these occasions where these people pop up and they have these incredible incidents that happen with all these glaring holes in the official story. And we say to ourselves, what's happening here? So in my opinion, that story was not very well researched by anybody. And but we'll keep our eye on it. Okay, so we were understanding with the name here and understanding with Mr. Janus, who had met Sir Peter Horsley on behalf of the royal house. He was sent out to do this incredible task of finding out more. And he really thought he had something here. He had no idea he was meeting an extraterrestrial. As we know, he told Timothy Good and others that Mr. Janus was reading his mind, knew all about the military installations and the nuclear facilities, and that he was looking specifically for a meeting with Prince Philip, who he felt could be the person who could kind of turn the situation around on the nuclear side. He never got that meeting, unfortunately, and we don't know what would have happened there. But right off the bat, Horsley informed him that's really tricky. You know, it's not going to happen. So let's now switch our attention to one quick thing that I found out. I wanted to point out about the meeting with Janus and Horsley was that road, which is King's Road at the junction of Smith Street and Markham Square, is where the meeting took place. Now, interestingly enough, Smith Street here, it says, is a quiet street in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and its salubrious location doesn't hint at the strange encounter that occurred there in 1948. What grabbed me was that it's Markham Square. And when General Martin sends Horsley off to meet Janus with this thing, he says, you're going to want to meet this Mrs. Markham. So, you know, he obviously was just using the name for the square there. The only other thing, I want to just concentrate briefly on this, which was when Horsley informed Janus that he wasn't going to meet Prince Philip. Mr. Janus was keen to meet Prince Philip, but Horsley said that this would be extremely difficult. Mr. Janus then began to talk about the physics involved in UFOs traveling such distances. This is significant because we always run into this. Horsley believed that Janus could read his mind as the questions Horsley was about to ask. Janus seemed to effortlessly segue and spoke at length about the subject of interstellar travel, the existence of God, contact with ETs, and the destruction of Earth. So there's the nice round picture of their conversation, and I recommend people check out his autobiography for that.
What was the year of that meeting?
The year of the meeting was 1956. And I do feel like it's quite significant because yes, there's definitely something to be said for this period of time when we're looking at in the 1950s, because they're setting up, they're looking at an inevitable nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States, and all these separate countries are hanging in the balance. So we're looking at a very pivotal time. So I'm glad somebody brought that up. Okay, so we've gone into Horsley. Now, on behalf of the royal house, they also wanted to infiltrate into the entire matter around the technology. And Olivia, you have a quick question.
They want to know the name of that book again.
Aha, the name of the book, I'll show it here. The name is The Sounds from the Other Room, but I want to show the actual picture. Let's take a quick look. And it's a highly recommended read. Again, it's Sir Peter Horsley, the autobiography. Sounds from Another Room. And then the subtitle is Memories of Planes, Princes, and the Paranormal. And I think that we do get quite a window on a very special interaction that he had, but also a window on Philip's interest in UFOs. Incidentally, both Philip and Charles have had incidents of UFOs flying by their private planes and creating incidents. And these have been reported in English newspapers. And when I look at those UK newspapers, I didn't print them out for tonight, but they are there. And I do think it's quite interesting. It's like this great reminder of, you know, they want some kind of interaction. I've read some truly bizarre stories as well. Some of them, you know, are quite wild about these ships and coming close by to royal grounds and just starting this slow descent, and the chauffeur and the gardener and people like that being quite freaked out by it. You know, but tonight I've stuck with just the stuff that was really hardcore that we could work with. So they become in a position by the late 50s, that is the Royal House and the UK military in general, where they're feeling a little bit left out of all the advances that are happening in relation to America's development of the X factor, which is this UFO file technology that's moving through our military program. And they decide we need to get on with it ourselves. And I want to point out this character because I never had run across him until I had studied the X aspect and the alternative technology. And files only recently have come up in relation to his work. But his name, in short, is Jack Frost. He is a UK aviator who became an engineer. And his real name, full name, John Carver Meadows Frost, known as Jack. Jack Frost. There's a good name for him. So he was born in the UK. He's a British aircraft designer. Primary contributions centered on supersonic British experimental aircraft. The chief designer who shepherded Canada's first jet fighter project. That's very significant. The XC-100 is his basic claim to fame, and interestingly enough, yes, XC-100 jet fighter. That's his main project. Now, he spent all of this time working deeply on sort of reconciling the shape and the idea of the actual saucer and creating them. And he created a number of models. And it didn't get declassified until much, much later. But I want to show you a few of the things that he came up with and how they got these things out. And I mean out of the record. This is actually the payoff. I'm going to do these in backwards order, but let's check this out. This is the U.S. Air Force's flying saucer, and it's linked to X-35 Lightning II. Okay, a view of emerging technology. This is a tech journal. The U.S. Air Force abandoned plans to build a flying saucer in 1961. Oh, I got news for them. No, they didn't. And yet a similar concept survives in Lockheed Martin X-35B Lightning II from August 2015. That the U.S. Air Force once seriously toyed with flying saucers is relatively well known. These machines, called Avro cars, contained giant lifting fans to raise them off the ground. This is the crude method to demonstrate the shape. They had no plans at all of using that. But in order to demonstrate the shape without showing off your UFO technology, this is how they did it. This was the Avro car there. And that's what Jack Frost designed. These records became declassified in 2012 and then another round in 2015. It's less well known is that the concept did not die when funding for the project was withdrawn in 1961. Indeed, a lifting fan is a key component of the Lockheed Martin X-35, and that's a big X there, X-35B Lightning II, that helps it off the ground during short takeoffs and vertical landings. Today, Desiree Francine Fendrigo, an independent writer in Brazil, go into the history of the Avro car and so on. This is actually quite nice, but the point is what happens and what Jack Frost contributes is he creates the shape of the saucer. So he's working with the shape of the saucer. And he is part of a team from the UK, which has come over now to Canada to work on this on behalf of the US military in cooperation with the Canadian military. So they're working on this reverse engineering of actual saucer craft. The X showing up there in this Lockheed project is very significant because they want to say that, hey, we're working, when they present their saucer, they want to say, hey, we were working off this whole airlift thing that Jack Frost did. Now, what's interesting about Frost, we have to show more of his designs first so we get a real kind of clear idea what's going on here. Now, the name of the design, let's take a quick look at this. We can see the saucer, and it's all this diagram stuff here. The name of the saucer design and the project is 1794. There's no explanation given for the numbers. 1794 those of us who are steeped in UFO history quickly figure out that's an anagram for 1947. No great surprises there. And 1947, of course, is the year of the UFO Roswell crash, the Kenneth Arnold wave of sightings, and a number of other encounters, including Maury Island, etc. These are cutaway sketches, more and more, but let me get to the crux of this. Bear with me. This is what they were shooting for. Let's take a look. That was their artist rendition. Yeah. That looks like a saucer. That's a good UFO that they redeveloped on it, and it has the United States Air Force sort of stamped right in the middle there. This was USAF Project 1794. It had just been declassified, this sketch, in 2015. The finished project that they were looking for was this. They got it and then some. But what they did with Jack Frost's work was, when Kennedy came in, they shut it down completely. And Jack Frost was, for all intents and purposes, out of a job and shipped off to New Zealand. And what's fascinating about this is they determined with Kennedy that they were going to have to take this particular project and move it underground. And so Frost participated in something. Actually, it was more thrust upon him the way it was thrust upon Jesse Marcel when they said, smile with a weather balloon and pretend that's what you actually saw. What they did with Frost is they took his Avro car, this very unusual saucer shape that I showed you earlier, which is meant to take flight and, rise vertically. They did these videos, and you might see them because they're still around, from 1960, where this clunky saucer thing, it's like, oh, we couldn't get it off the ground. Shucks, it's just not going to happen. Look at this thing. We try to make a saucer. Woe is me. It won't get off the ground. And this is what they did in order to discredit their own public work on this, and ultimately Frost's work. Now, Frost had designed incredible projects like the XC100 and all these jet projects for the UK. He was their lead man, and they sent him into this UK project because they were like, we need to get our hands on this technology. Although there's an Anglo-American alliance, and that's deep in the system, that's deep in the deep state, there's no question that they can play off against each other as well. And the Brits at this point were thinking, we're in kind of rough shape because they're really getting ahead of us on this technology. What are we going to do? So as it turned out, one of the nice things that they could do in the middle of all this is send one of their own guys in to sort of infiltrate the program while offering his expertise. So here he is offering this stuff. And he's gaining, he's putting this whole concept together. That's why it's been classified for over 50 years. But now they're saying, well, we're going to use some of his work in this Lockheed version, because when it comes out and looks like his stuff, there are going to be some questions there. Absolutely fascinating. So the X version that Lockheed is building based on his Avrocar design takes us back to 1960. 60 is the election. Kennedy gets in. They sink Jack Frost, and his work becomes this kind of weird joke of hey, look, it's a saucer that can't tumble out. So let's introduce Frost here to our lexicon of people that we are tracking the X factor through. What happens, and this vital, crucial step that I was looking for between Dornberger and his X-15 program, which was set up to chase UFOs, according to Philip Corso, and actually took pilots and crews on board, was actually taken aboard a UFO at one point. We're really looking at a situation where that in-between step between Blue Gemini and Dornberger's work was this absolutely crucial effort by the royal house and the royal family to get their hands back on this technology, because they felt they were falling behind. And again, the presidency, remember, was also falling behind, because we had Eisenhower, who was getting old, who had had a stroke, and Nixon was gearing up to take his place. Nixon was in the CIA Project Blue Book. He knew about these things. And eventually, as we know, he's going to leave a time capsule he's planning in 1975 to release this information. That was the target date, and they got him out in 74. It didn't happen. but when we look at this, we're getting into this territory where we have to understand what the links are, where the progression is. And I'm telling you, Frost and his work around the Avrocar and this saucer design, that's where the next leg of the X technology was. And that's why they sank it when Kennedy got in, because they were like, we're not going to even introduce, the guy's too smart. He's going to pick up on it. He's going to know what we're up to. We'll say it doesn't work and we'll drive it underground. We'll play with it at Area 51, in other words. Okay, so I think we've covered that sufficiently. So my impression, my research on this, my point of view is that at this point, the royal family and the British military have to take another angle because they've lost their key man. He's been shipped off to New Zealand. So he's no longer deep in this program. What are they going to do? And they bide their time and they work out this idea with the Americans that they can do their ultimate version of Area 51 at Pine Gap in Australia. And that's where we get Britain playing such a major role in bringing America into Pine Gap and that becoming the hub of all of our intelligence. But, you know, again, what was the original story of Pine Gap? It was for space observation. There's a good reason for that. And, you know, everyone says, well, they try to hide their intelligence stuff. Actually, they knew that cover would be broken so easily. The cover they're really trying to hide, in my opinion, is the redevelopment of the UFO technology. The UFO file moved with Britain's help to Pine Gap in Australia. And whenever it was threatened, we saw that the prime ministers always paid quite a price. So let's take one last look at Frost's design here. So we remember that, remember where they were coming from. So we've got now Horsley and his meeting with Mr. Janus. We have the strange messaging around the name Janus and the things that were exchanged there, and the fact that there's no real explanation as to who Janus was or what Markham was or why they were in that apartment that wasn't really there. You know, just a number of questions were left. And Horsley writes in his autobiography, you know, I don't care how people think about this. This is what happened. And this was a guy who had his finger on the nuclear strike button for Britain. So let's remember kind of the, I guess, the sort of prestige that's coming forward. But now let's think about Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth is in a very interesting position, because if Prince Philip has this going on, and she's the one who really, as the Queen, has the power to move in these situations. And if they sent their man Frost in for the Canadian-American cooperation version about redeveloping this technology, and it flopped because Kennedy got in and the military drove it underground, and they shipped Frost off, their next move is Pine Gap. So when we get into Pine Gap and the things that they develop there and the technology that gets developed there, we come into the first crisis in 67, which, of course, one of the major prime ministers for Australia will disappear at sea and his body will not be found. Very unusual. But he was objecting to this whole concept of Pine Gap, even though he had gone along with certain things. And, you know, there's pictures of him buddy-buddy with LBJ. He's starting to realize that, oh, we don't get any control over this base. You know, this is a bit of a problem. And the Americans are taking, you know, that sort of opportunity to say, well, we'll leave you very kind of small controlling interest, but we're basically going to take over that whole area. So what happens is Pine Gap, though, because it's in Australia and because the Australian military is going to interact with it, all those reports come back to the UK. And the Royal House is once again on the cutting edge of where the information. So they've kind of done a thing. They've invited the Americans into Australia and said, you can use this. It's a perfect position. But they're doing their own tracking of the Americans. And I'm going to show you how that works. Now, this is a very important thing. In 1975, of course, we've covered the events of the constitutional crisis in Australia and Gough Whitlam getting thrown out in this extraordinary measure by the Governor General dismissing him. He was a duly elected prime minister that the people of Australia had put in office. And they had done a number of things, including taken money away from him to run a budget. And they'd just done so many things to undermine his leadership. And he was kind of a Bernie Sanders populist type character, and his leftist leanings were pretty off the charts. But the main thing that they hated him for, in my opinion, there's a few reasons. But the main reason was because he wanted to get rid of the American presence at Pine Gap. He was absolutely against it, and he was working. And this is the kind of guy who could do things because he could rally people. So they were like, this guy has to go. Interestingly enough, a CIA agent, Theodore Shackley, was someone that they sent over to make problems, let's say. And, they had been used to in the CIA going into different countries and overthrowing elections and things of this nature. This is what they're good at. And but by 1975, Nixon had been thrown out of office in 74, also in a CIA coup, if you really go to the heart of it. But here they're looking at the Pine Gap situation. They were also looking at Pine Gap with Nixon because, as I pointed out, and I'm soon to get a very good version of this article, but you can at least read the headline here, and I'll read it for you. It says, Pine Gap does sci-fi research for Tricky Dick. This was a newspaper in 1975 in Australia that was showing, in 1974, that was showing the connection between President Nixon's efforts and Pine Gap. And what they were saying was Nixon planned to announce this energy independence coming from what they had developed at Pine Gap. They didn't mention it was an extraterrestrial substance that they were working with. They don't say, oh, he's working on UFO technology there, but they say what they're working on, this advanced gravitics thing, is going to change the energy paradigm. This is a big problem, and it's why Nixon, I think, trips into it. The more research I've done on this, the heart of the X Stenography of the UFO file leading us to where the technology went goes to Australia at Pine Gap. There's no question about it. And the crux point, just like the crux point in America with the assassination of President Kennedy as to who gets control of that UFO file, again, when we get to 1975, Whitlam wants to throw Pine Gap out. They've put all their facilities in. They want to throw the Americans out of Pine Gap. The Americans in Pine Gap are saying, we've done this complete setup of this Area 51 style situation here. We got the perfect cover, which is it's the ultimate spy satellite zone, and all the rest of it. It's not going to happen. Get this guy out of here. I don't care what you have to do. They turn to Queen Elizabeth, who knows that Pine Gap is her only ear now, well, only significant one, of how to track how the Americans are redeveloping the UFO file. That's it. So she does the extraordinary thing, which is she allows the Governor General to invoke the Queen's power over the sovereignty of Australia and pulls the plug on Gough Whitlam and dismisses him. It's the equivalent of the head of the UN coming in and saying, Trump is dismissed, but you get a new election. Don't worry about it. There was this incredibly vague statute in the setting up of the Australian Constitution and form of government that said the Queen had the right to assign this Governor General with the ability to do this, but it had never been used. And it, as far as Australia goes, it caused an incredible ruckus, and it's still known today. The dismissal is how they term it. It was the lowest point for Australia in politics. It was an absolute constitutional crisis. It was their version of Watergate. But in this case, it was coming directly from the royal house. Now, there's always been the cover for this on behalf of the Queen, that the Governor General exercised this as part of his prerogative and that she didn't arrange it. And, there's a few reasons domestically why they would do it, but I think to take the extraordinary action of dismissing him is because Pine Gap is at risk. Pine Gap is absolutely crucial, and in our reports on it here, we've gone and barely scratched the surface on Pine Gap. I'm getting so much more deeper information into it, and let's start with this. This is from The Guardian now. Snub over palace letters underlines why Australia should ditch the Queen. And it's a big article saying there's this big movement in Australia that says, she shouldn't have this ability to just snap her fingers and do things in here, like what happened, for example, in 1975 with Gough Whitlam. And this movement has been waiting for the Queen to pass away in order to get its full bearings going and saying, after she dies, we'll do it. But there's a movement in there that says, that's a morbid way to go about it. Let's take her powers now because we're sovereign and what's going on here, basically. So interestingly enough, they have this thing called the Palace Letters. This is quite significant. Let's take a look at this article. That is a visit of Queen Elizabeth in 1975 to Australia, which is the year that Gough Whitlam was dismissed. And the letters, in fact, are letters that are part of a stealth archive, as I've pointed out. And I'm going to read you a little bit about them here. Let's start with this. On Friday, the federal court handed down its judgment. This is the guy who brought it forward. In my action against the National Archives of Australia, seeking the release of the Palace Letters between the Queen and Governor General Sir John Carr regarding the Whitlam dismissal in 1975. You see, this guy didn't forget. This is only, March 18th, okay, of 2018. In a stark decision, Justice John Griffiths held that these historically significant letters, written at a time that he recognized as one of the most controversial and tumultuous events in modern history, interesting, should remain secret. Although Griffiths noted the clear public interest in the content of the records, he found that the legal issues do not turn on whether there's public interest in the records being published. The court ruled that the Palace Letters are personal and not Commonwealth records and do not come under the Archives Act, which would have required their release after 30 years. Instead, they'll remain closed until at least 2027. Okay, now we've seen how these stealth archives, like the LBJ Letter X, that's at his library, won't be opened until 2023. And even then, there's a little clause in there that says the archivist can look at it and say, let's hold it for another 50 years. Very much like what started this whole thing, which was the Trump release of the JFK records on October 26th of 2017, and how that was blocked immediately by the CIA. Now we have this rolling release. So all these stealth archives are related. The records releases are quite important, even though we know there's certain things that don't get into the record at all. Okay, so you're all still with me. Let's do this. So the court rules that the Palace Letters are personal and not Commonwealth records. Fine. So they are to remain closed until at least 2027, with their release even after that date subject to the approval of both the Governor General's official secretary and the Queen's private secretary. That means the Queen's embargo over their release will continue potentially indefinitely. So 2027, you say to the Queen's personal secretary, what do you think? Should we release these? And she says, no, that's it. So the stealth archives, you see, they sit there. We know that they're there, but we can't get at them. Now, I think that's the point that I've made with a variety of them, just like the first 4 Rockefeller reports for the Prosperity for America. And we've shown that here and gone through that. But basically, those, they released so many of these things to the public, but they kept the first 4 reports private even to this day. And the special studies group that Kissinger was in charge of, they were studying UFOs, and that's why those files are still secret. LBJ's letter, the X letter, there's no question Eisenhower's time capsule, they all, which was called Project X, and Nixon's time capsule, they all relate to the UFO disclosure aspects from different angles, and each one can take a certain amount of credit. Now, let's go a little bit further. This guy's record. From a purely common sense perspective, it's difficult to reconcile the court's view of the Palace Letters as personal and not Commonwealth records, with its description of them as addressing topics relating to the official duties and responsibilities of the Governor General. So here's what they're saying. The events in 1975 were not something that the Governor General decided, who had been appointed to kind of, he's the Queen's representative there, and he doesn't really do anything. He's just, it's like a figurehead position. So, but in this extraordinary case, he dismissed Gough Whitlam, who wanted to close Pine Gap. Now, the letters show that she was coordinating the expulsion of Whitlam from the Prime Minister's office. That's what they don't want to show, 1. 2, the importance of Pine Gap is in those letters. That's the other thing they don't want to show. 3, and there may be references to why Pine Gap is so important and Whitlam has to get out. Because if it were simply a matter of a 40-year-old political situation in which they dismissed Gough Whitlam and the Queen approved it on high, big deal. That would not be cause for concern from the royal level. They want to shut it down because there's something in the letters that relates to the reason Whitlam was dismissed, and the reason was Pine Gap. I have no doubt about it. Now, just to close out this guy's article, as Whitlam's biographer, I spent the best part of a decade working through previously unexamined archival material, and in particular, Carr's papers in the National Archives. It was in these papers that the previously unknown role of Sir Anthony Mason, who was a High Court justice, was revealed. Mason secretly met with Carr over several months, acting as an advisor and guide for the Governor General, and even drafting the letter of dismissal for him. His involvement remained hidden from the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, at the time, and from the Australian public in our history for another 37 years. This is significant because these are all people related to the British government and within the arm of the Queen, and she reached out to make this happen. And the Governor General was her tool, as was Sir Anthony Mason. And this is what this guy has come up with. Now, what's fascinating is we have a quite a ruckus going on with this guy trying to get those letters, just as we're talking about things like the Nixon time capsule and the National Archives letter. I'm telling you, these things often work together. And there's kind of a chain reaction, I think, going through these different things. But the stealth archives also have the ability to stay outside of our sight because they're there. You can't reach over the line and take them because they're under kind of legal rule. So it's a very tricky thing. And even if somebody gets them by some other reason, they can be, taken back. So you need like a WikiLeaks for all the stealth archives to come out. And this is the nature of the situation. But I want to show that from the Queen's point of view, for them to be fighting to keep those letters secret in such a fashion. Now, this has been going on for a while, and they're really pulling every royal legal trick in the book to make sure those letters don't ever come out. And there's quite a public outcry in Australia to have the letters. So they're batting the ball back and forth, and we're looking at a very dynamic situation. The key to it, though, the biographer of Gough Whitlam doesn't get it. He thinks it's about Gough Whitlam. It's about the reasons Gough Whitlam was sacked. And the reasons that he was sacked is because the UFO file and the work that was going on at Pine Gap was too secret for them to discontinue at that point. Nixon's role at Pine Gap, saying he was going to turn the world energy independent, and with an emphasis on the US and the UK, that was going to happen in 1975, according to that article. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at this X Stenography representing the UFO file moving through history. And these major figures like prime ministers like Gough Whitlam of Australia, or President Richard Nixon of America, or President John F. Kennedy of America, trying to get at what? This UFO file. And the UFO file remains out of their reach because it's that big of a secret that the group that controls it has the ability to pull it. Now, let's bring it all up to date. Here we are looking at President Trump. He is dealing with a situation where his own CIA is not cooperative with him, and there's a group that try to do an end run around some kind of version of disclosure, which was John Podesta, Hillary Clinton disclosure. And when she didn't get into office, they decided to do it anyway, and it comes out in this freaky version in the New York Times waving a flag saying, well, there are aliens. There's an alien threat, or there's a UFO threat, right? Threat. That's how they use it. And so they were trying to create some kind of corridor of funding in the public for this, because that's where they came up with the whole phony corporation of TTSA. But Trump, on the other hand, is doing something very interesting and unusual. He has developed the idea of a space force. He was working on the Space Corps, which would have the Air Force answering to the Space Corps. That failed. They weren't able to do that, but he did reignite the Space Council, and he's working towards this future of space economy. Now, we are in a position where we can see that Trump, as we went through in the previous episode, his uncle was the one who was called in to observe the effects of Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla had been working on this death beam, as he called it, that would take down flying objects. Never said planes, flying objects. And that's very significant because just a few years later, the government of the United States would start using the term unidentified flying objects. So when the FBI guys are hustling John Trump, who we have to remember, being Trump's uncle, he's an MIT engineer, but also he is under the mentorship of who? As we revealed here for the first time last week, Vannevar Bush. And there he is with Harry Truman and the president of Harvard. Vannevar Bush, who is the key figure in the UFO development program on the scientific side because he's so brilliant. And he's also quite a patriot. He's somebody who's going to keep his mouth shut and work on this. And that's who they set up to do it. But Trump's uncle is very significant because you take Trump's uncle and they have him checking out Nikola Tesla's work because he's thought that highly of to do this because he's Vannevar Bush's protege. So it's pretty simple to start to see these connections. But now Trump and his uncle are very close. Trump references his uncle very often and says, oh, he was talking to me about the scary things that we had going on with weapons back then. And, even back then at the time, he was sharing things with me. Well, if he knows the secret of the UFO file, he passed that on to Trump very early. Later on, we find Nixon developing this. This is a public record now. We've helped to bring forward the fact that Nixon was very close with Trump. What did he tell him about the UFO file? Well, the letter that Trump has sitting in the Oval Office about run for president and you'll win, basically, he keeps that in the Oval Office, means Nixon holds a very significant place in his mind representing this. So if Nixon left a record, a message regarding what he was going to do, and we know that the Nixon administration supported the Bob Emenegger documentary, as we've pointed out on this show many times, which was called UFOs Past, Present, and Future. Well, there's his version of disclosure. He's moving it through the DOD, giving this guy incredible access until Watergate. Watergate derails that process. Nixon thinks he's going to be a hero. He's figured out the China game. He's figured out the Russia game. Now he's going to figure out energy independence and make the U.S. supreme. Instead, they take him out because aspects of the deep state aren't ready to capitalize on the UFO file and the information that was going to be brought forward. Nixon was using Pine Gap. The Queen, who had lost a lot of access back in 1960 when they got rid of the Jack Frost project and drove it into a black budget and shipped him off. And so there's their main guy on the inside. He loses access. So they start Pine Gap. They start their own observation of the American operation for redeveloping the UFO file. That is something that has to be understood if we're going to get a handle on the things that are happening in relation to the UFO file, the X Stenography, and where the project goes. And then you can see the political dominoes fall around that, like Gough Whitlam in Australia in 1975. It's a crucial moment. I would say if we were to track some of these crucial moments, really, the meeting of Horsley with Mr. Janus in the early 50s is very significant. The meeting with the Blue Gemini program becoming the replacement for Jack Frost's efforts on behalf of the UK in order to get in there and spy on things. And then Blue Gemini being shut down by Robert McNamara, who's Kennedy's defense secretary, saying, thanks, but no thanks to Blue Gemini, because he said that would create two space programs, basically a secret one and the national one. So not going to do it. So they do eventually develop it on their own because they get rid of Kennedy and the conditions are right. But we can see that these political events that we see, just like when we're looking at the things that are going on with Trump, and when we see Robert Mueller trying to prosecute him for Russian collusion and all the rest of it, and how Trump has to become more and more of a cold warrior just to stay out of that zone of being attacked. And we're, every 5 minutes we're throwing out new Russian ambassadors. I mean, where does that process go? Eventually you have no ambassadors and there's no one to talk to. I mean, that should be the last thing that you do. So the incredibly hawkish position of America on Russia now is an outgrowth of all the things that we're talking about. So when we look at the X Stenography, when we look at the UFO file and where it travels to, and now we contemplate the UK aspect and Pine Gap being in Australia, fundamentally still, even now, under the Queen's rule, just like when she dismissed Gough Whitlam. That's when her Governor General did that. On the record, she didn't do that. See, her representative did because he had the power to do it. So her blocking the records gives us some idea now when we're looking at this that the Queen understood the value of that base and what's gone on there over the past 40 years. Well, fascinatingly enough, they our friend who has taken so much of the intelligence and brought it out, which is Edward Snowden, he brought out so much about Pine Gap. And the program that he said was listening to everyone's phone call, kind of a universal Bluffdale type of operation, was called X Keyscore. Again, so the X is inevitably in the heart of that. Now, I wanted to point out something which is interesting around this and may or may not be related. But we have that incredible Valentic disappearance, who was a young pilot in 1979, and how they caught a picture of a UFO right over Valentic's plane, and then he vanished. And on the radio, he was heard to say, "This green glowing light is surrounding me, and this craft is sort of playing games, appearing and disappearing, and I can't get away from it." And so Frederick Valentic disappears, and it's quite a scandal in Australia at the time. And I found out something very interesting, which is that there was a farmer who came forward, and they're trying to get more information about this, the people who are working on the case. But a farmer came forward and said that the next morning, there have been more witnesses who said that the UFO was chasing Valentic's plane. But there's a number of them now. There's up to 8 who've seen it at different times. And this, it basically kind of swallowed his plane. Now, interestingly enough, this farmer wakes up the next morning after Valentic disappears in Australia. And in his, the acres of his backyard, he looks down and he sees there's a craft matching the description, this kind of green saucer glowing. And it's got the Valentic plane stuck to the side of it, and the Valentic plane is leaking oil. And he stares at it, and it's just sitting there. And he actually writes down as much as he can of what are the identifying numbers and seal of the plane. So whatever happened there, whether it was experimental aircraft that we were running out of Pine Gap, which picked this thing up and was trying to discharge it, or was intentionally grabbed it, it's very hard to say, but I can't help but think that case, the more that we learn about it, is going to be related to the examination of Pine Gap. Also, the idea of it as a genuine UFO, again, one of the fascinating things about our research is UFOs and Australia are so linked. There's so many incredible sightings in Australia that it may have been one of the reasons why they chose that in the first place as one of the places to go to redevelop it, just as the fact that we see in Nevada and New Mexico absolutely off the charts in terms of the number of sightings that take place there on a regular basis. So they're looking at the kind of heart of the activity, and they decide this is where we're going to set up shop. So I think with that, now we'll move on to Olivia and
Already?
your questions. Well,
Okay.
how is your gang tonight?
Well, you didn't give everybody the notice that we're about to go to questions. So,
Oh, okay. Let's do that first because I have more. So this is a good time to ask your questions and put them all in caps for Olivia. We'll run through them, and basically, there's a couple more things along this root of the royal family I wanted to get to. But let's just kind of recap.
Can I start with one thing?
Yeah.
Okay, so John Wood said to Google Annie Leibowitz's 2007 Queen portrait and examine the first of 4 photos in which she is glancing over her shoulder. In the wall mirror that conceals the door to her private chambers is a reptilian.
Oh, no.
So everybody can go take a look at that.
It's an interesting thing that we haven't been able to look at the Queen properly since they brought up all the reptilian stuff. And I think actually we do ourselves a favor when we move, so much has been said about that, just like the Anunnaki thing. Let's move our attention to what Elizabeth has done, what her activity around the UFO file is. And we could do that in a way that does not touch on any of the kind of wild mythos there relating to it. But that is pretty funny. I'm glad they mentioned it.
I did ask the group whether, how many of them believe in shape-shifting reptilian aliens, etc.
Yes.
And that connection to the royal family. And it's about a 50-50 vote.
Well,
so.
It's interesting. Now, here's an interesting thing. The idea of regal blood representing a different bloodline goes back to the idea of Adam and Lilith before Adam and Eve. There's a separate bloodline trace when we go back and we look at it. And we also have the daughters of men versus the sons of God. There are different ways that they phrase these things. There's no doubt that there are splits when we look at this. But I would say it's very, so when you look at something like royal blood and the bloodlines and who rules and the reasons for that, you can look at an ET connection to that idea, to those thoughts, to those symbolisms. But I think that we've been roped in by a kind of a comic book version of what that would be by going into the straight up ideas of lizards and reptiles, because you can talk about that on a whole metaphysical level that makes sense. But when you are trying to convert that into physical reality, things get very tricky. However, like we bring up on this program very often, Mac Tawney's brought up a fascinating, the Crypto-Terrestrial book, which is a very thin little book. And his idea was that there was a group that were very advanced, that they were very close to human, that we were kind of like a parallel development, but they were just a little bit ahead of us, and that they had gone out of their way basically to hide themselves from us. And those are the types of things I think where we can understand royalty, when we can understand crowns, when we can understand where this comes from. And are we looking at things that happened at a certain time in our own past relating to things like Atlantis, for example? So it helps us, I think, if we don't reduce the royal household down to a kind of a comic book reptilian thing, which I think comes so much out of the work of David Icke. And that stuff's out there. I mean, it's out there and it's digestible for anybody that wants it. But I don't feel like that is going to help us get the answers around the X series. Like, the X Stenography is so important that I think we're tripped into something where we can get answers without relying on a kind of a reptilian punchline, which, in some ways has been played up too much, really. And let's get into more kind of hardcore research in relation to this. I'm not saying that these answers that we get are going to be non-fantastic. I mean, they're going to stretch our own ability to look at things. Look at Mr. Janus. He got a meeting with one of the top military commanders who was the close advisor of the Duke of Edinburgh. I mean, that whole meeting is on the record. There's your best disclosure from a high official. I don't understand how it's so underplayed. When I was reading his biography, I was blown away. So I think it's important for us to get more into what we have, rather than just like the stealth archives. We can kind of we can see them. We know that they exist. When I pointed out to you that Eisenhower kept a time capsule, it's in even the mainstream Evan Thomas book. Evan Thomas is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's Mr. establishment. He was a part of Newsweek for many years. He says there's a Project X time capsule. So, we know that we're getting our hands on something here when we do this. So, but I'm glad that you asked it, because of course it's inevitable that it would come up. But I was kind of banking on the fact that maybe we could get through the Queen Elizabeth aspect of this investigation and looking at the royal house and what they're involved with without any of that, because I don't think that we need it. Interestingly enough. Okay. What have you got?
Okay. Flip the Neck is asking two questions. A saucer landed on the grounds of the Lord Mountbatten's estate in the UK. The British royal family and their relatives seem to be of great interest to the ETs, I think, and vice versa. And he also was asking, ridicule in the British press prevented what would have been a meeting between Prince Philip and Adamski in '59.
Yes. This is important, since we mentioned all this about Queen Elizabeth. You think I made enough noise with the paper, Olivia, on that one? It's pretty good. That's an all-time high. This is important. The image of Queen Elizabeth, and she's carrying on a tradition of royalty that I think is very significant. And we have to keep this in mind when we're dealing with it, that it's beyond establishing like America is establishing the presidency, the royal house. They have been carrying on this tradition for centuries. And so she's the kind of titular head of this entire power base. And so that's a very incredible position. And yet on the ground, it's very hard for her to pull levers of power here and there. That's why her connection to Pine Gap is so significant. I'm sorry. Okay, I wanted to just round that out. Give me that again.
Both of them?
No. Okay, so let's fire off with this. No, you were kind of flagging the end of that. What is it?
Oh, I just wanted you to hold it higher. You're not holding the.
No, that was
okay,
yeah,
good.
It was perfect. Yeah. See, that's the very top of it. It doesn't go any higher. But thanks for the reminder. But yeah, and it is. I mean, it's an incredible image, and obviously, it's an incredible incarnation for the Queen. And I think that we can kind of get our hands on some facts about them by looking at them on a very level basis, which is they're holding this incredible position, and what secrets are they after? Let's look through them to see the things. Let's look through their fears too, to see what it is that they're operating with. What are they trying to handle? We'll get a better feel for who they are and what they're all about, I think. The Adamski thing is absolutely fascinating. Adamski, of course, who was meeting with these incredible Pleiadian style beings in California, had also been very involved in kind of what would be called sort of theosophical. And we've seen a few people like this come out over time. One of the guys who came out like this over time was Richard Keenanger. And Keenanger wrote a book called The Ultimate Frontier, and he wrote a very unusual series of books after that called Observations, which are very slight. What happened with Keenanger is he's tried to start a group in Stell in Illinois, which was going to be a new kind of technological Garden of Eden, would survive. It would be like a new kingdom of heaven and all these things. And it turned out that it became very cultish over time. And he, under pressure, Keenanger sort of developed a lot of unusual qualities to him. I think he became very neurotic, and it was turned out that later he had actually maybe borrowed a lot of what he wrote in the original book, The Ultimate Frontier, from someone named Dr. Stell, who had been part of this Lemurian fellowship in the 1910s, 1920s, and then knew Keenanger's mother, and Keenanger would go as a kid and pick up on all this guy's stuff. And but Keenanger had a very interesting idea about what UFOs were, and this is why I mentioned him in relation to Adamski, because Keenanger said that UFOs were these advanced brotherhoods that were transporting things, and that they had this advanced technology, and that they didn't share it with the above ground world, that they worked in their own circles. And we know brotherhoods come up very often in theosophical literature and anthroposophy. There's an understanding about it. there are the Gurdjieff group talks about, you know, places like Afghanistan and Turkestan and stuff having these mystery schools and brotherhoods that operated in caves and stuff like that. And very often when we look at some of the things that have happened, like the bombings in Afghanistan and so on, you wonder exactly what was going on there and who they were after. But I do think it's interesting that when we look at these different explanations for what was happening, that there were all these people coming forward and saying, well, you know, I belong to the secret brotherhood, or I met this Venusian, or I met this being. Now, a lot of those you can dismiss because it's just the zeitgeist of the time. But there's also some people who just have absolutely kind of rock solid credentials, like Peter Horsley. And, you know, there are many speculations about Eisenhower and his meetings with extraterrestrials. It seems like they were showing up in very human form at that point to warn us about something. And Adamski was the absolute core of it. But you're right, he became kind of the toast of the town at a certain point. He was going to meet Philip. It got out, and, you know, the royal house didn't want to be embarrassed by it. So the meeting never happened. But I do think it shows Philip's deep, deep interest in the reality of the UFO file. Yeah. All right, you're up.
Okay. So Gilar Veer is asking, does DJ believe reptilians might exist aside from the more fantastical aspects of the idea?
Yeah, well, you know, you do get these people who, I'll answer it this way. You know, I refer to the Allagash incident a lot because I think it's one of the most solid ones that are on record because of the people involved. And I've met one of them. And the other two actually are both mass art teachers here, are retired now. But their best estimation, what they saw weren't grays when they were abducted. Their best estimation was that this thing looks like a large insect. That was the only way. And they're very logical. And both being artists, I think that they had a good visual idea of what, you know, how to describe something from a level to someone else. Being artists, giving us that whole frame of reference. So they're saying these things look like big insects. So when we stretch that out and we look at other cases where people have said, well, these aliens resemble something like a reptilian, for example, we're applying what we know, our best case scenario. Someone out there mentioned mantids, and that's right. The mantid cases and the mantid beings, I did a show in September on that with Linda Moulton Howe, which is fascinating. And very often they're always associated with wisdom keepers, and that they're holding the wisdom for the earth. And I've met people who claim to have had these interactions with these beings. So I think that shapes and dimensions and figures shouldn't be ruled out. So if somebody mentions that they were in an abduction and they saw something that looked like a reptilian, I don't think that should be ruled out. I think that the sensationalism around it is one thing, but no, I think it's absolutely legitimate. I mean, look how unusual the grays are, right? You know, with the big heads and big eyes and little bodies. It's an unusual, whenever we encounter aliens, it's always unusual. And even when they look human, they look too good, you know, like they're kind of fantastic looking. And so it seems to me whatever is operating there has the ability to alter its appearance. And there are stories now about Eastern wisdom masters who also had this capability. There's an interesting story that Ouspensky tells in relation to Gurdjieff about how Gurdjieff did this at a certain point. It's something he learned in these brotherhoods where he completely morphed from his normal self into this kind of regal, princely figure. So I think appearances, when we're dealing with something as supra-normal as alien encounters, we should take all of the descriptions into account. Absolutely.
Okay. Pat's coach wants to know about Billy Meyer and the Plejaren.
Wow. I was just reading new stuff about Billy Meyer, and it wasn't so flattering. I will say this has always been my impression about Billy Meyer's material, and it goes back to a conversation I had with Timothy Good, who I think is one of the best. But he said in 1964 that when he was in India, he met someone he almost met Meyer there, but he met a friend of Meyer's and a woman who knew him. And Meyer had just left. But there was kind of almost a cult type thing about Meyer then in 1964, because wherever he would go, these sightings would occur. So I don't think that Meyer, what apparently happened is that there was some kind of activity relating to Meyer and encounters, that some of those, there's too many people who saw these beam ships and things with him. But it looks like later it just stopped, and there was a lot of chicanery around the whole thing. And, odd things came out, like there were backup singers that they used as pictures for Pleiadians and things like that. So it became a discredited case on that basis. However, we run into these situations when we look at people like Meyer, where, they bring forward so much at a certain point, and then their information gets funny. So I think that there are two stages, that instead of saying someone's real and someone's fake, that there's a middle ground, which was someone had a real experience and then went on to kind of gild the lily, as it were. So I think that's where I would stay on that one. I would not rule out that some of the things involving Meyer were legitimate experiences, but even if they weren't, the idea of Pleiadians visiting and them having very heavenly kind of features goes along with reports from the Mormons, Howard Menger, and we were just talking about Adamski and all those 50s scenes with the Venusian idea. So there's definitely something in our psyche that relates to these images.
Okay. CC Jarvis, how far back has DJ traced the X symbol regarding gods and space brothers?
It goes so far back and so far beyond the kind of 40s version, but we have to take it for how it relates in our regular everyday world. When we track it now from the 40s, we're in a modern era of that. It's over the past 70 years or so. So that's a good way for us to relate to it now. But of course, we found X Stenography in the 19th century through Delshau's drawings, which also said Trump right in the middle of them. I have them here, and I'm happy to show it to anyone. I have showed them in a few shows, and I think they are fascinating. But it looks like the X goes as far back to early Egyptian and Sumerian times for what we know. And then if you go into the deeper aspects of what it represents, you're going to find lost civilizations there as well. But I think the way that it's used now, we can trace more. We can definitely trace it through the 1940s, but we can definitely go further back into the 19th century to find that X.
Heather Polly wanted to know, where's Janus now?
Mr. Janus?
Mr. Janus.
Mr. Janus disappeared. He never showed up for another meeting, and his partner in crime there, Mrs. Markham, she was never real in the first place, probably. And General Martin, it's very unusual because General Martin appears to have been someone who was part of this whole thing, and he withdrew from the picture. But I always wondered, why didn't Horsley go and really mount an incredible effort to track down General Martin and say what happened to these people? Obviously, that part of what happened is secret. But I do find it fascinating. Now, here's something I didn't mention about Peter Horsley, which is when he was going to do his autobiography, what happened to him? Well, a BMW showed up outside when he was getting into his car and smashed into his car, and he survived. But he felt it was absolutely an attempt to take him out. And, they couldn't, what they did, the police said, well, there were some terrorist groups who may have pulled this off as like a message to the royal house or whatever. But oddly enough, when you look at that whole scenario and situation, that doesn't make any sense at all, because he was a retired official. They were trying to scare him from putting the Janus information in the book. I'm absolutely convinced, because a year later, the book came out. So let's put those two things together, which is somebody wanted him, basically, and his secrets about Janus and the Prince Philip's and the royal house's interest in UFOs to just die, you know, and they didn't want him coming out with this autobiography where he talks about it in a chapter. I'm telling you, that thing, as far as real research around the UFO file, is absolute gold. You know, forget about Gaia TV and all the claptrap that we see out there. I mean, you have some incredible information that we can get our hands on, and that's definitely a part of it. But I think the story of their attempted assassination on him is crucial.
Matthew Ravo wanted to know if there is a correlation between Pine Gap and the Westall incident.
Wow, that's so interesting. I've always felt that the Westall incident is very unusual. First of all, what happens is a number of saucers show up over the school and cause a mass panic, and then a number of the students see and interact with the crafts, and one of the crafts crashes, basically, or it has to do repairs or something. And the people involved, the entire incident was covered up, and the guy did an incredible documentary of it. And if you look up, I think, just the Australian Westall UFO on YouTube, it's out there. And he went back because he was one of the school kids who remembered the incident, and he went back and talked to the students and the principals and all the rest of it, and how the American officials had been on top of the scene, like practically, you know, within 10 minutes or something, and that they came in and they questioned people and intimidated people relating to it, and that they attempted to get their hands on this craft, which apparently the craft and its friends were able to take off with. The Australian history relating to UFOs, I think, is absolutely crucial and fascinating. I think the UFO bases in relation and the sightings and the waves of sightings that happen in that part of the world are absolutely, you know, phenomenal. And I think it's because of where it is, and there's so much water there. And I think a lot of these bases are underwater. So a lot of the enigma around Pine Gap relating to the UFO factor, when we look at the cases that are famous in Australia, we start to understand why they put Pine Gap there. Whether they're directly related to Pine Gap redeveloped craft is a question, for sure. Wow, great. Olivia, you're up.
Okay, Cassandra Helwig. Has DJ reached out to Roger Stone regarding the time capsule, and if Roger would approach Trump about finding it?
Well, I put this up on Facebook today, which is Roger Stone and Alex Jones had a conversation about whether someone called in and said, did Nixon ever tell you anything about UFOs and dead aliens and things like that? And he mentioned something about 3 meetings in the questionnaire. Well, he didn't get around to what it was. And Alex sort of blew through it and was like, you know, are there space aliens? Did Nixon talk about that? And Stone talked about how the Jackie Gleason story about Nixon taking him to Homestead Air Force in Florida and showing him crashed wreckage and dead aliens. Now, the story comes from Gleason's ex-wife, and it's absolutely legitimate story. It's been checked out, and I've talked with the best people about that. So I do think it's interesting that came up, but the answer is no. I have not reached out to Roger Stone regarding the time capsule, but there are feelers out, I think, pretty strongly at this point to the Trump administration.
Okay, Nicholas, can we please have a show explaining the different aliens? And then earlier, people were asking when you might have Linda on the show, and I think those two could be combined.
Yes, Linda's coming up for sure. We're going to have some of the greatest guests in the spring come on the show, and we just have some fantastic shows coming up and themes. But Linda is always there, and I'm always talking with Linda about the various things. We work on things together. You know, doing a show about the different types, I think, is fascinating. The what's significant is the role of the grays becoming the dominant. You know, it just became everything for how we related to the subject. Whereas if you go back before that, they're struggling to figure out what the whole alien thing is about. But what I've learned really is that it seems like it would be my opinion that it's the Greys and the Pleiadians are the two dominant groups that are involved. But there are unusual ones. There's a Hopkinsville, Kentucky incident that takes place where these beings kind of terrorize this house, and these kind of farmers and stuff, they come out with their shotguns and they shoot at them, and the whole place is, the family's terrified. And it's a very fascinating case. And what always got to me about that is that Edgar Casey grew up maybe about 2.5 miles from where that incident took place. So I wonder if it's just kind of a strange zone, as it were, because he had these apparitions of angels and disincarnates and things like that there. But there's no question those, whatever those were, they didn't look anything like Greys or Pleiadians. They were very different. So yeah, I would love to talk about more types.
Jean-Francois Paulin
Yes.
would like to know, do you believe in Pleiadians? Straight up.
Well, it seems legitimate to me that there's a race that is a little more advanced than we are, but very related to us. I think there's been a lot of, from the Mormons through the kind of Venusian mythology and the various encounters that people have had to suggest that this is absolutely true. And the idea of the actual Pleiadians supporting life goes back, of course, to the Greeks and the Seven Sisters and the Egyptian mythology around the Pleiades. That type of tight regard and respect and stories and lore about it would lead you to believe that if we're in the realm of accepting the reality of off-world civilizations, that's a very good bet that we have some ancestors there. And but you know, sometimes when people talk about the Pleiadians, they are very angelic. They're, you know, they seem to be on this incredibly higher plane of existence. So it's a little confusing for what we think of as physical. And it would seem to me when Pleiadians showed up at different times in history, and I've talked to different people about this who've had these types of encounters, but when they show up in history, I think it's pretty easy for them to have been taken for angels because of their manner of, you know, their kind of visual presentation. I will say this, that I had an incredible series of conversations with Rick Thurston, who channeled the Transcenders and who was a crucial aspect of giving Stan Fulham the prediction for the October 13th sighting over New York City in 2010. And he was a Canadian, absolutely fascinating guy. And I taped so many of our conversations. And I think he, in the Casey style, was doing something quite incredible, which was he had this amazing psychic ability in trance. But one of the things he told me in relation to the Pleiadians that I found fascinating, take it or leave it, is that the way that they learned so much about humanity was by working with them side by side. And one of the ways that they had done that through history was by becoming blacksmiths. And so I went and researched a lot about blacksmiths and always found out that they were associated with, you know, transforming metals and with magic, and they often kept to themselves in communities, but they also interacted, so to get a feeling for humans. So that I think is an interesting place to, you know, if you're willing to kind of get out of the bounds of regular thinking, that's a good place to go.
JJK is asking the $64,000 question. Why is the alien presence afraid to make themselves known to us?
Well, they're not completely afraid to do that. It looks like our own governments really have been hostile. And as we can see with, you know, the makeup disclosure stories of the TTSA and Luis Elizondo talking about threats and trying to get more DoD money to fire at I mean, you know, we got over this. Just like we learned some things. We went through the Cold War and we learned that nuclear weapons were dangerous. Now everybody's flinging them in each other's face. Like, I don't understand how we've gone in a circle here. We made these incredible advancements. And in relation to the UFO factor, I think we had a better understanding of the topic. Now, you know, there's always an unknown factor when dealing with something as mysterious as and incredible as UFOs. So you have to be aware of that. But I think in relation to the actual off-world civilizations visiting here, let's take it from that level. If they're coming in and they're visiting here, they might be trying to observe and influence the culture as much as possible without really disrupting it straight up. And people will say, well, that whole idea of the prime directive comes from Star Trek. You're just using kind of Star Trek thinking. Well, the Star Trek thinking came from somewhere. And people who were studying Star Trek very often, I find all kinds of themes that relate to theosophy or Casey or Ahriman. So those people were reading these things and integrating them into scripts. So for us to say, well, that's a Star Trek idea. No, it's a human being who was a writer in the 1960s who had access to Steiner or Nietzsche or, whatever it happened to be. And that's what influenced them to write things. So this idea of the prime directive, meaning that they can't come in and they don't have the ability to come in and disrupt. It's against their kind of constitutional rules to come in and disrupt our culture. I think is very valid. And I think it might be a good reason. We do see that when, I think there's two different levels of looking at the alien interaction. One is people on the ground, when a craft shows up, they have one reaction to it. They talk with each other about it. They're mystified. It's a mystery. And then there's this kind of bogus thing that comes in with the official story. They try to cover it up. They pretend it's a threat, whatever. So it's the official people that need to get their act together on this. The people on the ground, I think, have a pretty good interaction. As far as the beings themselves, could they make themselves known? I think that they understand that their role is, there are probably groups in there that want to stay, like the Greys, want to stay out of the limelight because of what they do, which very often involves abduction and testing and stuff like that. So groups like that, I don't think would try to present themselves too much.
What do you think the Greys' agenda is?
From everything that I've researched about them, they seem to be very scientific, and they seem to be doing observations and cataloging. And I'm always reminded of the kind of Noah's Ark type of scenario where they're cataloging and characterizing different aspects of DNA that exists on this planet. But I would say that for their own purposes, it seems like with things that we see like animal mutilations and human abduction, that they do things that are pretty like out of bounds, but seem to be scientifically related. So I think it's interesting that there's such an emphasis on that type, that they seem to be really the dominant group that's visiting. And it seems like the Pleiadians are a close second. There's that famous story that the Greys came to Eisenhower and said, hey, if you let us do abductions and stuff, we'll give you fantastic technology. And that the Pleiadians came to Eisenhower and said, we'll teach you the ways that you can lift the culture up, basically take up their whole vibe. You won't need all these weapons. And that Eisenhower and the military were like, well, we'll work with the Greys because we can't work with this other idea, because they were offering kind of like spiritual advancement, and that we were interested in weapons. So hopefully that answers the question. All right.
Najat Madri.
Najat.
Yeah, mentioned that John Lennon was recorded as saying he saw a spaceship.
Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating thing, and May Pang tells the story about them being in their apartment in New York, and Lennon yelling for her to come quickly to the window, and them observing this kind of classic flying saucer there, and Lennon saying later that it was so close he could throw a baseball at it. But I've always felt that people like Lennon and other people in history are very special, and that these things happen. It kind of reflects, it's a reflection, like a very average person can see them too. But there's something interesting about some of these celebrity sightings because they reach so many people. And I think someone like Lennon, who was pretty advanced in his thinking, he was somebody who really was very early on understanding things like the deep state, and he used his art to create a political movement. I mean, he was an extraordinary person, and wow, I do think his sighting was exceptional. And whenever a celebrity sees a UFO, my antenna go up, because I'm always wondering what's involved there. You know, Jackie Gleason's absolutely obsessed with UFOs, to the point that Nixon knew, and that's why he took him to Homestead Air Force Base to show him. But if you listen, there's a number of Long John Neville shows with Jackie Gleason in 1958, and I've listened to them with Jackie Gleason talking about how we need to figure out what this is. We need to get to the bottom of it. We need to understand it, and the public needs to get on board, and the officials need to talk to us about it. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. I mean, this is Jackie Gleason we're talking about. Of course, he made his own house into a flying saucer. So yeah, just incredible.
So where does that story come from about the deal with the ETs for weapons?
It's been in the literature. Now there's a number of sources for the Eisenhower meeting with the ETs, and their cover excuse was that he needed dental work, so he disappeared for 3 days. And but Stanton Friedman, who was a really hardcore kind of nuts and bolts, cross the T's and dot the I's kind of guy, he told me that there was enough substantial information and testimony about Eisenhower meeting with an off-world civilization that he took it seriously. That said a lot to me, because he's not the kind of guy you really would think would go along with a story like that. Obviously, in the literature, there was enough there. I've run across those stories, and I've always taken note of them. But the book, right off the top of my head, that's the best on the Eisenhower thing, I can't think of what would be the best book there, but the stories I think are pretty solid, like Stanton said.
Okay. Ivasovic J. Doesn't Trump wanting a Space Corps mean he's interested in weaponizing space, same as the TTSA crew?
Well, I think it's a little bit different. But I think that there's the possibility. See, the thing is, if the public gets our heads wrapped around the fact that we spend a little over $1 trillion in defense on the planet each year, that's known about. That's the public side. It's probably more like double that amount. But that the United States spends $700 billion of that. So obviously, we're driving such a military budget, and it's dominating everything that we do. That's why the CIA is involved in movies. That's why the CIA is getting involved in the UFO factor. They've been involved all along, but I mean publicly. So when we look at that and this military thing that's driving it, and then the military moving into space, Trump is thinking, I think, that he can take control of the issue by having a Space Corps, and that he can get access to these things. He knows he wants to go where the power is, and that we've seen this in his life over and over again. But I do feel that he knows more relating to the UFO subject because of his relationship with Nixon and because of his uncle. So I think that we need to look at him a little bit differently. Whereas somebody like Clinton, for example, was out of the loop and tried to get his hands on some of this, and that Hillary Clinton's idea was working with people in the DOD. They could do this kind of phony disclosure thing to get her hands on it because she thought she was coming in. That's where the New York Times TTSA Harry Reid disclosure came from. And there were a lot of bogus elements to it.
I haven't heard of this, but obviously it's a meme out there.
These are great questions, by the way. Wow. Thank you,
Ronnie
everyone.
Anona Moss. Is there going to be a mass alien takeover on the 18th of April?
Well, I hope not.
And linked with that, I guess Philip Gillenwater is asking, is this the year of disclosure?
Well, you're getting close to something. I mean, didn't Sir Peter Horsley give us disclosure in the 50s, and writing his book in 1998 about what happened to him in the 1950s? I mean, it's the equivalent of Mad Dog Mattis coming out and saying, guy showed up and, basically, I think he was an extraterrestrial because he knew everything about our defenses, and he talked extensively about this, and then he disappeared. I mean, this link with the Queen and Pine Gap and Peter Horsley, I think we already have disclosure on that front.
Sorry,
You gotta-
Jack Russell.
Yeah.
Can they do it before we pay our taxes, please? I'm with you.
I don't think they're gonna. That's not gonna change anything. They're gonna, if anything, they'll probably create a new taxation system. But what would happen, of course, is energy independence would come into the fore. That's where Pine Gap comes in, and specifically because whatever Nixon was up to, he felt that they were ready to churn out this alternative energy that they had got from the UFO file. That part seems clear. By the way, the picture about what the alien presence idea would mean and all the different implications, I think there's a lot. There's a lot to, we could do a series of shows about it. What I'm trying to do is track the X Stenography to where the technology moved to, and then kind of bring us in so we understand the cases that are the best, that are so important relating to the UFO encounters and things of that nature, and the people who did the best work, or like John Mack and all the rest of it. It's not that we're harkening back to their work and saying, wasn't that work great, and not going forward ourselves. It's that we're taking the good work and kind of getting the mess off the top and saying, this is where people did good work. This is the stuff that we're building on. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Okay.
So David Buckwalter, I think that's how you pronounce it. It's weird. Greer says all ETs are good, and Tom DeLonge says all ETs are bad. Yet they both have the same insiders in their organizations. Any thoughts?
Well, they're completely diametrically opposed to each other in public now, and Greer has taken off the gloves in relation to them, and I don't blame him. It's a CIA operation. They completely have taken over, and there's a buffoonery that is a hallmark of some of this, that they tried to use DeLonge in this kind of stooge manner. I'm not saying that his interest in it was, but they sort of, his approach fell apart pretty quickly. And I feel that they were doing their own kind of market testing with it. And then we had people like Elizondo come out who didn't explain their credentials in relation to how they were getting videotapes, and then the videotapes had problems, so I have to say, if I were to weigh the two out, that I would prefer Dr. Greer's work to anything that came out of the TTSA or DeLonge's work, which I think is a complete CIA fraud. But I'm not saying that I go along with everything that Greer says in relation to benevolent aliens, but I think that track is a better track.
I really want to address this.
Yeah.
Okay, so JR says, Cryon says there will be no invasion. There are no bad ETs in the universe. And can I just put my 2 cents in here? It's a huge universe. We have obviously good and evil here on our planet, and we have as above, so below. So why would it be any different that you go anywhere in the universe and have all one good thing or all one bad thing? It seems to me that duality would exist everywhere in the universe. So
isn't it interesting? Yeah, you're absolutely right. What's fascinating about it is, I think when you get to a higher plane of existence, that is more of a spiritual, it's the result of spiritual understanding. So the physical part, and if there are good or bad ETs, I would imagine there's a lot of projection that goes on in relation to this, which is we project a lot of our own reality, which is we understand good and evil in this way. But if there are off-world civilizations, then I think it's pretty much a safe bet that they there's going to be a mix of objectives in relation to it, and some of those objectives won't be things that I would be beneficial necessarily. Just like, a group that's doing observations of Earth and doing testing of human beings and stuff like that, from their perspective, could just be gathering information, but the people on the ground get pretty traumatized. So that would seem pretty evil to us, where on their side, they're just kind of doing, their research, and they are starting to figure out how we operate. But, it's a fascinating idea, granted. And I don't think that we should project evil aliens. I think that's a mistake. So yeah, it's a balance. You have to kind of take it in a balance. But there's nothing right now that suggests that it's only benevolent. I think that that's a little faulty.
Okay, so could you address Emery Smith and his autopsies?
Yeah, Emery Smith is another kind of Gaia showboater. And I don't think that the idea of his doing autopsies of 3,000 different alien types, and his stories really, for me, don't add up. And he was strangely involved and took pictures of that Atacama mummy. And so I would say that it's going to take more to understand exactly where a guy like that is coming from. But I have not found anything valuable in his testimony.
John Wayne Everett, what do you think is around the bottom of the ocean near Long Beach, California, Catalina Island?
There's all kinds of suggestions that we have military bases that do very secret things out there. That there are, if you are an alien civilization, you're coming here, one of the things I think Ingo Swann said was that you're going to look for deserts, you're going to look for mountains, you're going to look for water. That's the best way to keep yourself concealed for what you're doing. And so I think base and underwater activity and the USOs, things like that, are absolutely fascinating. When you look at cases like the Bermuda Triangle and the things that people talk about there, very often there's UFO sightings in relation to it. So it could very well be that their presence creates disruptions in space and time, things of that nature. So, but yeah, there are just these activity zones whenever you go, and you're looking at one of them right there for sure. What else you got?
Scribbles 4444. What does DJ think about Kim.com and his claims to have helped Julian Assange with, quote, info?
Whenever I watch Kim.com, I enjoy it. He seems to be on the ball to me. And I think he's one of those people they targeted in the deep state, that is, because they thought he was helping to swing the election to Trump, because he was trying to bring things out and was suggesting there were secrets that Hillary Clinton was keeping. And of course, we know through WikiLeaks and their repeated releases of those emails that they were keeping a lot. And, WikiLeaks is the story of the 2016 election, even though Trump got in, because WikiLeaks exposed so much of the kind of treachery that was going on through the DNC to first oust Bernie Sanders and to, kind of do all these various things through Podesta. And I think those WikiLeaks releases brought the kind of transparency that we needed, which is why we got the results that we did. But I would say Kim.com is a man to watch. Okay.
Phase Templar. Does DJ think Dr. Roger Lear's implants are alien or military?
Interesting. Well, they're certainly real, and Lear spent his life figuring that out. I think people like Whitley Strieber were crucial in bringing the whole idea of implants out. And there's no question that there were people who had these. I think without more study of what they are exactly, it's hard to say. But I wouldn't put it past either group to use them. We know certainly the military does, and I wouldn't be surprised if these other groups needed ways and means to track people that they've interacted with. Absolutely.
This is a fun one. So CC Jarvis again. Anybody see the video of Putin riding with Hell's Angels Russia? The entire crew rides with X flags flying from their bikes. Another X connection, perhaps.
Oh, I gotta see that. Wow. Oh, I can't wait. That sounds fantastic. Of course, always look to what's on the ground, motorcycle gangs, Hell's Angels and things like that. Those people see a lot, just like the people who truck goods across America, or people in different kind of on the ground occupations where you see things. We get so much of our information from the media about what's actually happening. Whenever something like that comes up, I always take a second look. So I have to see that. Excellent one. And of course, the X flags. Well, there you go. This is definitely the year of these types of revelations, I'm convinced.
Okay, Aaron White, what does DJ think about the China airport UFO incident?
There's been a few actually, and I think that China is a real hotspot for these incredible sightings. I don't know why. It's very interesting, but it seems like the craft that operate over in Asia, just like the Japanese sightings, are always, it's so different than what we get here. The craft look different. They do different things. So our stories certainly are a little more, they come in a kind of a certain tradition of like, people saw craft, somebody got abducted, somebody came back with a story, the craft came back and their families involved, but in Asia, it's like, a village disappeared and then it came back, so it's a very unusual, different type of thing there. And just like that incredible story about, I can't think of the name of it, but it's a mythology where this woman comes out of a craft and that's in a Japanese scroll and she kind of brings wisdom, so it's these different cultures have taken the UFO phenomenon and interpreted it different ways. I'll tell you, besides China, a real motherlode of information is the Russian UFO program. It is absolutely crucial. The Russian UFO file must be neck and neck with our own.
I'm a little loath to ask this question, but I also feel like I want to address it myself. And it's basically, here it is, Alpha Draconis. Ask Daniel if he is CIA disinfo. Let's see what he says. Legitimate concern.
Well, see, these are the types of ridiculous.
Well, actually, I have the answer for this if you want me to spiel this one. Okay, I mean,
no.
I really
hold on. No, the thing is, like, when somebody, the problem with doing information, news reporting in the alternative arena is that anytime someone doesn't agree with you, you're a CIA agent. It's ridiculous. Get over it and get over yourself. If you think, when you're looking at somebody's information, if you think that there are things in there that you don't agree with or that don't sit well with you, then, take what is useful for you. But no, I don't work in any capacity for any intelligence agency. And the thing is, the important thing is the type of work that I do exposes that type of activity to such a level that it's kind of obnoxious because, someone can be out there just kind of like tweeting away, oh, so-and-so is a CIA agent or something. It's pretty much a waste of your time and mine. And if anything, that's not going to get us to the kinds of answers. Look at the kind of material that this is accessible to this community. Look at Peter Horsley's story. Let's grow up. Let's get moving into a good direction. Let's move into stories that we can understand and get answers for. And let's understand people like Merritt coming forward, who was associated with the FBI and the CIA. I mean, these are people who can tell us things about that. But I see a lot of that stuff in the alternative media where people fling things at each other. And what was fascinating is for a while, when they got to the Tom DeLonge aspect, it was like, hey, now instead of just calling everybody a CIA agent, they actually will be CIA agents. I'm just going to be surrounded by them. So, yeah, that's one of those things. Okay, next.
What do you think of Project Serpo?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I have to say, there is something that came out of that in relation to Reagan's interest in the UFO aspect that I think is valuable. I think there's a lot of fluff, and we're better. See, a story like, in theory, anyway, a story like Serpo couldn't really survive so well now because we have sharper research. We're better informed. It's easier for us to sift through. That's why even a lot of things that came out in the 80s and the 90s, we could kind of get to the core of the situation a little bit better. So that's important, I think. And, so we're in a better way to do it. So my feeling is there are people who there are things that are talked about in Serpo, but I wouldn't accept the story as it's told. The idea, generally, by the way, of us doing exchanges or of us having secret space groups that go out and do these things is absolutely possible. And I think there's a good string of evidence that we have a secret space program, which is kind of the bigger question around something like Serpo, in my opinion.
Heather Polly, does DJ think the 411 phenomenon is related to UFO abductions?
The 411
The
phenomenon.
missing 411?
Oh, David Paulides. I think that was his conclusion. And what's fascinating to me about this, and what's so interesting, is that after a while, using police techniques, he came to the conclusion, wow, it seems like there's a sighting in the area where this person disappeared or had missing time or whatever it happened to be. And over, he came up against that. Now, I do think that it's easy to extrapolate too much again, but some of that research around people going into national parks and disappearing or coming back unusually, and that the whole dressed backwards thing is classic extraterrestrial, activity, that kind of abduction activity, which I find very strange. No question about it. But yeah, that is fascinating. What else you got?
Rick Knight, is UK Echelon the silent hand behind the NSA Pine Gap? And what does that mean?
There's no question that they are. The NSA seems to be the dominant organization, which would lead me to believe that the NSA is in charge of the communications aspect at Pine Gap, but that the CIA are the ones who handle the UFO redevelopment program. I think if we want to go to the heart of where the X research leads us, it's leading us right into Pine Gap at this point. I think the Echelon program that's coming out of Pine Gap is dangerous because it flouts constitutional sovereignty. And I think that there are legitimate spy satellites and things like that. Countries just do that with each other, and they all track each other's conversations. And I do feel that, we need to be aware if a country is setting off a nuclear bomb or, so there's legitimate purposes for these things. I'm not really talking about that when we get into it. What I'm getting into is the hidden aspect of what they do. And, we know with things like warrantless surveillance and with the different programs that they have for getting information and storing it, like Bluffdale's University, which stores all of our emails and all of our phone calls. And had we said that a decade ago, somebody would have said, that's the major, craziest conspiracy I can think of. And then now we know it's all true. So we have to draw that line and draw upon the Constitution in dealing with these people, because they seem over and over again to want to be able to flout that line and to kind of dare us to bring them back into reins. And it seems like whenever we've tried through people over the years, it hasn't worked out so well. Now they want to tell us who the president should be. So I'm absolutely 100% opposed to that kind of really fascist structure. And I think that these groups, they might start off with the idea of thinking the national security, but they go so far beyond the line and they cross into deep state reasoning, which is, I'm doing this for my own purposes and, for the higher purpose of what I'm working on. But there are definite constitutional protections against that type of eavesdropping electronically, and we have to enforce it. But wow, yeah, that's a good question. Really good question. What else you got?
So, what is your stance on AI? It's a big question.
Yeah, it's a real problem. It's a real problem because it's getting us into transhumanism, and we're doing a series of shows that will deal with transhumanism. So you're going to get kind of a bigger answer there. But I would definitely say that the AI aspects and the idea that we can program a machine to govern certain parts of your life that go beyond navigating your car or helping your software program, when we want to put it in these exalted positions and when they move towards the transhumanism in society and they want robot bartenders and driverless cars. Of course, they have accidents now with those driverless cars. That's going to set them back for a while. No, with the automation, they're going to overreach. It's going to be overreach. You're going to be throwing people out of work. There's nowhere where those jobs can't be replaced. They're not thinking straight about it. They're just going for a kind of corporate profit idea. But on the other hand, there's a group that is absolutely dedicated. The Davos crowd certainly is. They're dedicated to this kind of transhumanist thing where they get beyond the human aspects of society, and there's occult implications to that as well. So, they're coming from this place in the tree of life where in order to move up, they need to move into machine. And that's not a kind of a spiritual development, but because in their occult understanding, that's their next step up, they're moving themselves there and they're taking the culture along with them. And that is a kind of dehumanizing step. And if you go dehumanizing enough, then you and I become, the enemies for them. So this idea of them merging with machines and using AI to make critical decisions, I think is disastrous. I think that the technology can be used in a very important fashion, and it can help humanity rise to the occasion. But the minute we become, I mean, look at the Terminator movie. Amazingly enough, made in 1984. It's really all there, really is. And now we're walking into it willingly. There's something wrong with this picture.
Now, John is asking, what does Daniel think the ultimate goal is? Is it total human control, and why?
The ultimate goal of the deep state?
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard for a small group of, say, 5,000 to 10,000 people to control 7.5 billion people. So consolidation and control, I think, are their answers for things. And I think that deep in these programs is a superiority, they feel that they're ascending themselves and their group into these royalty positions. And we started off with royalty tonight. Interesting, we didn't get too many Queen Elizabeth questions, but I do feel that they are electing themselves as these kind of superhuman controllers. And I think that these people, in many cases, are not dealing with the full deck, as smart as they are. And I think that their job now is, in order to get the 7.5 billion people under control, I think that they're going to utilize the technology to the hilt. That's what we're seeing. That's where the disruption comes from.
Scribbles 4444 again. DJ's take on Lockheed Martin's hiring people to work in Antarctica.
Wow, what a great question. Well, Lockheed is the very heart of the deep state. As a matter of fact, when Jim Garrison was tracking into the JFK assassination, there's a very unusual document I bring up, which is when he's talking to the Ramparts editor, which is kind of a big magazine in the 60s. And he says, the oil men weren't as involved as we thought in the JFK assassination. I've isolated my research down for the aerospace industry being responsible for the death of John F. Kennedy. Now, that's so crucial when you think about the types of research that they were doing and how Kennedy kind of represents us in the public state trying to open up the world and get freedom going and get expanse going and lead the culture by taking us to the moon and things like that. And there's this other thing which is concerned with dominance, which is concerned with military might, with military budgets going through the roof, 700 billion this year. I mean, we're getting into kind of a tricky zone. So what they're doing with Antarctica is fascinating because they're setting themselves up there. We've been hearing all sorts of things, but Antarctica lends itself to a lot of mythologizing. But let's see what we have on the ground. We do have very strong indications that there's something unusual in relation to Antarctica and its position, and some of the incredible high-level figures that Joseph Farrell tracked going there in 2016. A lot of that research was hijacked and came back in the most bizarre ways through bizarre people. But the truth is, there's a great mystery going on there. And it seems like, you know, Lockheed, Catherine Austin Fitts calls them the United States of Lockheed. And I think that that's kind of where it sits. You know, they control so many of the databases that the government runs, from the military to HUD to others, that in many cases, Fitts makes the point that when she tried to get information to do backtracking of where the missing money was, she would just get a no when she was a government official. So now she's taken that whole process up to the missing 21 trillion, and that is just the amount of money that we're in debt for in America. So you can see the kind of political significance of a military contractor assuming too much power, and a small group, again, controlling a much larger economic picture. This is the problem that we're having. It's centralized control. The same thing happened in the Soviet Union. The United States is not the Soviet Union.
Christine Taggart, what does DJ think about the Hopi prophecies and what they say about AI?
Well, those are fascinating. There are better people than I who would discuss Hopi prophecies, but I do read them, and I think that a lot of what they're talking about relates to our, so let's say, the next 100 years and the kind of phase that we're going into. And, you know, I think that a real exploration of what those native cultures were trying to tell us, from the Lakota Sioux to the Hopi, is absolutely crucial. It might be kind of the inheritance that they left for us, in a sense, because they were so close to this kind of higher understanding, being so close to nature and having that spiritual background. You know, a lot of them come from these what we call lost civilizations now too. I mean, that's where their roots are. So yeah, absolutely fascinating. So we'll take a couple more questions. It's a great, absolutely great gang out there, amazing, and it's a huge crowd tonight, and the questions are just off the charts. So I really appreciate it. I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com, because that's where you can sign up for our newsletter. That's how we stay in touch with each other, how I stay in touch with you. As we know, it's a little iffy when it gets to social media. It's not always the best way. So that way we get right into your inbox, and we can tell you when things are coming up, like the incredible shows we have going on. Olivia, you've done an amazing job tonight. Let's take the last few questions.
Okay, hang on one second. I kind of got lost in the chat, so give me 1 minute to catch up here. Where does the 21 trillion number come from?
That comes from the research of Catherine Austin Fitts of the Department of Defense and HUD, and she had tracked their financial transactions. And then there was a Michigan State professor who said that can't be true, and called her up about it and said, you know what, I'm going to put my students to the task, and we're going to make it this big thing where we'll investigate it. And he found out it was true. So then he came forward. That's Professor Mark Skidmore. And so it's an absolutely solid figure from a real money person, Catherine Austin Fitts, and then a university professor and his students who went and found out that this were true. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. But I think that's where the heart of the missing money is, the Defense Department. Now, what's interesting is originally Fitts found money missing back around 2000 from NASA, but Skidmore's students weren't able to find that missing money. So it's pretty interesting. But 21 trillion is a figure they all agree on, and it's absolute. Think about that amount of money being missing. And, you know, it's ridiculous because the Department of Defense came out and said, yeah, well, we have 6.5 trillion in missing transactions. They admit that much themselves. So Fitz's number, really, what is that? Another 14 trillion? I mean, it's not that different if you think about it. So yeah, absolutely fascinating.
Smiley face, have all the JFK files been released?
No, definitely not. And there's more difficulties around them, because when they're saying, here's a release, and then it's all whited out, what good is that? So the crucial ones that are left deal with George Joannides, who was a major CIA figure. And of course, the Jim Garrison investigation, which they've whited out pretty much completely. Those are two of the most crucial, I think, And Trump he got a good gang of them out, and they're supposed to continue to roll out between now and July. So we'll see how many we have by July. But as I understand it, we have less than 25%.
So what are your plans for the coming months and the year? What are your goals for 2018 for the show?
Oh, we're doing so many incredible things. We're working on a documentary, and I'm also, we're doing so much with the live show, and then we have incredible interviews that are built up that will be coming out in later in April and in May. It's going to be just a great year, and we have great stuff coming on board, like the space fence research of Elena Freeland, the missing trillions from Catherine Austin Fitts. So we're really blessed with some great minds out there right now, and so I think our most important task is to keep ourselves out of all the kind of crazy pulls from the media on the traditional side, and then in the alternative side when they're trying to pull fear porn or hope porn, whatever it happens to be. Let's try to keep right down that steady line, because we've got the right people and the right subjects right now. And I think together we're reaching some very interesting places. We're going into new territory, and I think that that's the most exciting aspect.
Okay, I think Kids Future will get the last question. What movies/TV shows does DJ recommend, i.e. reflect truth?
Wow, what an amazing question. There's so many. We always talk about They Live because it is a very interesting time capsule of a movie from 1988. And, he is really having a hard time, the main character in it, figuring out what's going on here until he finds this very interesting pair of sunglasses. It's an incredible movie, and I recommend everyone watch it because it tells us a lot about what's going on. But I think in general, as far as truth is concerned, there's incredible amounts of information out there. Some of the classic movies that deal with the topic we're talking about, like Roswell with Kyle MacLachlan, for example, is a really great demonstration of Jesse Marcel's life. And I think they brought the kind of care to making the movie that gives us all something a little extra special. In terms of books, one of the great books that I recommend is The Strange Life of Ivan Osikin, which is a P.D. Ouspensky book. It's a very small book, which is why I recommend it. And it's maybe a little obscure to reference here, but it brings us into this idea of recurrence, which was picked up in Hollywood by things like Groundhog Day. But this is important because very often we are looking at situations where, we run into these problems where it seems like, as I said earlier with the nuclear aspect, are we replaying 1988, where there's the standoff between the Soviet Union and, and the United States? I mean, we're kind of in this weird loop. And even when they're talking about the UFO stuff, they've brought up the fact that we were going to disclose this thing on an official level, and then things happen. We're looking at kind of the same situation now where people are manipulating the dialogue around these things. So I think that book is good. And whenever you get around subjects like recurrence, I think it lets us look at things a little bit deeper. I always recommend Professor Peter Dale Scott's work. The American Deep State is, I think, the best political examination of modern life and the deep state, which, remember, Professor Peter Dale Scott coined. I have a number of interviews with Professor Scott here, and I recommend everyone view them. Everything that I got is, from working with Professor Scott over time, and he's been very generous with his time with me. He has to be really the most unheralded. I mean, people like me understand him. People in the deep political research understand him, but he's somebody that I think really everyone here in this chat to take a deeper look at. Peter Dale Scott, professor at UC Berkeley, now retired, but still writing, and just incredible resource. Wow. Olivia, amazing job tonight. Those are some of the greatest questions. You were a great crowd, and I think that we really came up with something tonight in breaking through where the UK aspect and how the Pine Gap situation developed. Pine Gap is going to be deep on our radar for the next episode as well, and I look forward to seeing everyone. Please definitely stay in touch with us. Ask us your questions, send questions, and let us know what's on your mind. You've all been an incredible resource also, and I want to thank you for that. I look forward to everything that you have to send us. Make sure to sign up for the newsletter. Don't be shy to subscribe to the site. It's about $4 a month. I mean, for the incredible information that you can get, that supports the show. These are the kind of things that you can do. And now it looks like it's burrito time with Olivia. And,
yeah, and I'm going to throw in a movie recommendation at the last minute of My Dinner with Andre.
Wow. And there's a particular scene where he talks about the 60s was.
Yes. The last gasp of humanity.
That's pretty interesting. What kinds of things were they plugging in on in that movie? Wow, just incredible. But if you've seen any good movies, let us know for sure. And have a great night. We'll see everyone soon. And I really want to thank you for the great feedback that we've been having in relation to the X series. And we're going to go deeper with that. Of course, Nixon's time capsule is something that we're keeping very close eye on. And any of those updates we'll put out immediately as soon as we get them. So thanks so much. And we'll talk to you soon. And
thanks, everybody.
I'm sorry, I got you.
Have a great night.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. And a shout out to everyone, too, because I wasn't able to talk to you personally by name tonight, but I see some great people out there tonight, like Christine Taggart. And I know Rika, the hopeful volunteerist, was out there. It's always good to see her. And thanks so much. We'll talk to you next week. Okay. Nicely done. That's